This week. Oh, sorry. I couldn't see my video, and I usually allot for a couple of seconds, Johnny, and then I looked over and realized I was looking over in the monologue. This week, we welcome Mark Dufresne, Vice President of Threat Research at Endgame, for an interview. We're going to be talking about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, so stay tuned for that. In our second feature interview this evening, we welcome John Walsh, a DevOps evangelist at CyberArk. We're going to talk about their Conjure open source project, the open source community around it, and all things about vaulting for applications. In the security news, how to use the Shodan search engine to secure an enterprise's internet presence, Apache Access vulnerabilities, or a vulnerability rather, vulnerable controllers could allow attackers to manipulate marine diesel engines. ICS, this just in, ICS security is played with basic, avoidable mistakes. All that and more on this episode of Paul's Security Weekly. This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where exploits run wild, packets aren't the only things getting sniffed, and the cocktails flow steady. It's Paul's Security Weekly. NetSparker, the developers of desktop and cloud-based web application security scanners that enable you to automatically identify vulnerabilities in your web applications and web services. NetSparker scanners employ a unique and dead-accurate vulnerability scanning engine that automatically verifies vulnerabilities with their proof of concept. For more information, visit them on the web at netsparker.com or email at contact@netsparker.com. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/PSW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter.
Despite the restraining order, Paul Asadorian is back in your house right now. Paul.
Whoa, thanks, Doug. Well, oh, sorry. I hate it when podcast hosts do the talk with a cigar in their mouth. Welcome to Paul's Security Weekly. This is episode 579, recorded on October 18th, 2018. We're, of course, here in G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island. To my left, it's the illustrious Dr. Doug White.
Hello.
What's going on?
Oh, I'm here. I'm back on Security Weekly.
I'm glad. I'm glad you're here.
Yeah. I'm like,
it's going to be fun.
Keep coming back like a rash.
That's right. I do have a rash that actually keeps coming back.
See?
I keep getting poison. I can't. The poison ivy, man. It's terrible. It's terrible.
Some people do that willingly, but no.
I'm sure there's a site for that.
There's people out on the edge, you know.
That's right. Yes. They're out on the edge. On the lines via Skype or Zoom or one of them, Mr. Carlos Perez is here. Welcome, Carlos.
Hey, Paul. Happy to be here with you.
You sound excited, Carlos. Not really, but it's been a long week, huh? You sound tired.
Oh, yeah.
Alrighty. Also on the lines, Mr. Jeff Mann is here.
Hey, Paul. Hey, good to see Carlos for change and Doug in the studio. I am fresh back from Atlanta, where I was speaking at the ISSA International Conference, and I've got a story to tell about an evening I spent last night with one of our friends, Joe Gray. So stay tuned for the news segment.
Anxiously awaiting that. Also, Mr. Joff Thayer is here with us. Welcome, Joff.
Hey, good evening. It's Thursday again. We need to pep it up. A little excitement here. Carlos is like, how's it going? Just like, well, I got this thing. No, it's Thursday night. Let's have some fun. It's Security Weekly.
Well, it could be Stoner.
You
Stoner
obviously got your
Weekly.
power back on, right, Jeff?
Yeah, Joff has power this week. You got the power.
Yes, I'm coming to you from hurricane ravaged North Carolina, where I was without power for 48 hours.
Oof.
But it was rough. But I did have a generator, run the beer fridge and stuff. So
that's important. The important things.
48 hours.
If you're interested, Carlos is like, that's not
Yeah,
Yeah, he's like 48 hours.
He's like,
I 48 months. Or?
Carl's like, I still am running on generator power. So if you're interested in quality over quantity and having meaningful conversations instead of just a badge scan, join us. That's right, we'll be there at this conference, April 1st through the 3rd at 2019 at Disney's Contemporary Resort for InfoSec World 2019, where, if I don't mess up my teleprompter, I can tell you that you can connect and network with like-minded individuals in search of actionable information. Use the registration code, which is really a discount code, OS19-SEC-WEEK. SECWEEK, OS19-SEC Week, and that gets you 15% off the main conference or a World Pass. You should be there because we're going to have a lot of fun in Orlando.
We
Good,
did
clean
last
fun
time.
in Orlando. It's Disney, right?
Yeah,
you guys were
right.
just there for Microsoft Ignite.
We were just there for Microsoft Ignite, and it was fun for that. They had Universal, though, so
That's true,
Microsoft
yes.
rented Universal Studios, which was also interesting.
I heard you guys walked a lot.
We walked a lot. We didn't partake of butter beer. It was the nastiest looking thing. It was like some kind of sludge in a cooler, and I was like, it's free, but I'm not taking it. No way. I don't care if Harry Potter drinks it. I'm not touching it. I did try to get Mark to eat like 20 hot dogs and get on some kind of whirling ride so we could see what kind of,
That'd be awesome.
colorful
Should've filmed
splashes
that.
we could get.
Except he's the camera guy, so.
I know. That was the whole problem with it. And I was like, Mark,
No
you
one's
have to
there.
film yourself vomiting on the ride. Come on.
Oh, boy. So I'd like to introduce our first guest for this evening, Mark Dufresne, who's the Vice President of Threat Research at Endgame. He's responsible for Endgame's efforts to understand cyber threats and develop capabilities to detect and prevent malicious adversary techniques. Mark, welcome to the program.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you. So, Mark, I think a lot of our listeners know about the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but I feel like it's not as widely known as some things might be in security. So you could start, Mark, by telling us why MITRE created this and what the MITRE ATT&CK framework is.
Yeah, sure. So I would say we didn't really have a common language to describe what attackers actually did once they got in a box. You're probably all you're familiar with the Lockheed Martin kill chain, which was really popular a couple years ago, and we still all talk about that once in a while, but that wasn't really, in our opinion, in MITRE's opinion, detailed enough to really be actionable in any way. So what MITRE tried to do, and we think it's a great thing that they've done, and there's a lot of momentum behind it now, is try to break the adversaries, primarily their post-compromise actions. So things like what do they do once they land on a box? They try to persist on that box. They try to evade the defenses that are there. They might try to look around, and then eventually, what are their actions on objectives, exfilling data, or whatever it is they're going to do. So they've done a really nice job providing a mapping of a nice universe of techniques that have been observed used by adversaries, in past attacks. So we use it at Endgame in a lot of different ways. It guides some of our activities. We think it's the best mapping that's out there right now for this sort of thing.
Yeah, it's interesting, Mark. There's a lot of guidelines, standards, frameworks that we see. I mean, a lot of us have been in security for a really long time. Doug and Jeff, a really, really long time. So
Since before it was called security.
I had to qualify that. Does the attack framework live up to the hype? Is it really being adopted? Is this really good compared to the smattering and just plethora of other standards, frameworks, and guidelines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it lives up to the hype, most of it anyway. I think it has gotten a lot of hype. I mean, at DerbyCon a couple of years ago, we were just starting to talk about that. This year, it was just it seems like half the talks were about attack matrix and how to action that. So it's sort of there's becoming some risk almost of that just becoming a buzzword that has, again, could be used in empty ways, and all of a sudden it's rendered meaningless because it's so popular. But we really think there are useful ways to use that, but it probably does have some limitations like any framework does.
Yeah, and Mark, in your opinion, what are the limitations to the framework?
Yeah, just for example, I mentioned earlier, we use it to guide some of our activities at Endgame, not all. I mean, for example, we put a lot of energy into some really good machine learning-based malware classification on my team. I don't need the attack matrix to tell me that that's something I should do. We're just going to go ahead and do that. Another thing we started to see a little bit of energy around is attribution with the attack framework, because MITRE has done, really almost as a way to provide references for some of the techniques. They've mapped a given technique to where it's been observed being used by an adversary in the past. But I don't tend to put a lot of stock into that. It's kind of nice to see what techniques have been used by what actors historically, but that information is quite fragmentary and certainly not a good way to predict what a threat group's going to do in your network or attributing an observed attack chain to a specific adversary. So, those are some limitations, and there's some other ones that there's a lot of. Some of the cells are pretty non-specific and not particularly actionable. What would be a good one there? Just a lot of them tend to be really noisy, and we have to dig in a little more to sub techniques. I guess one example of that might be process injection. There's about dozens of ways, a dozen plus ways you can do that, depending on how you count them. So just saying, hey, attackers might inject into processes. You need a lot more fidelity to try to address that. And I think on that latter point, MITRE is planning on doing some things to address that and add some more granularity to some of those types of techniques.
My concern in the category of limitations is anytime we start to adopt a standard or framework or guideline, there tends to be, as is the case, I'll say it first, PCI, that people say, well, I'm PCI compliant, therefore I'm secure. And I think we're starting to see this with the MITRE attack framework, where organizations are like, well, I'm doing really good in my MITRE attack framework and detecting all of those vectors, I'm secure, right? And Mark, obviously that's the case, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on how that's been going specifically with this framework. Yeah,
exactly. The DLL and shellcode injection is a good example of that, because you might say, hey, we're good on process injection detection. We can detect reflective DLL loading, but again, then you tell your boss, hey, we're green on this. We don't have to worry about this, and all of a sudden you're totally blind to every other technique and putting no energy into solving those problems. So yeah, I think again that is the whole question of how do you measure against attack is a good one, and there's not a lot of consensus around that. And then what does done mean is really an open question too. But those limitations aside, it does remain probably the most useful way to start thinking about, hey, what do I have the data I need to do my job, and where do I have gaps, and which gaps should I try to address with focused activities to get more data, write more analytics, and all that sort of thing. So yeah, it's limited, but it's pretty useful. I think it's a great starting point in the tool for folks to use.
Jeff?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was at ISSA this week, I had a couple conversations, people asking about the attack framework, and I had to confess that even though we've talked about it on the show, I haven't actually dug into it yet. But I guess a basic question that I have is, who's the target audience? Who before we either answer the question, how well is the framework being adopted, who actually would benefit from it? Who's the ideal audience or user that would benefit from looking at the attack framework?
Yeah, I think the immediate set of people who it's useful for is just the blue team, the SOC, the people doing the day-to-day work, to again measure, hey, do I have the data I need, and do I have coverage that I need, and do we have to address some of these gaps? It's like a daily tool. I think there's some energy around trying to make it actionable for executives who, they're always just sitting around and asking the folks in the SOC, hey, are we good? Are we good? Are we good? And how do they know if we're good? And coverage across attack is becoming a way that that I think practitioners are trying to communicate to management, hey, yeah, we're good, or we're not good, and we need investment in these areas.
And one thing I would say is we have to be careful that these don't become discrete kind of approaches where it's just okay, box checked. Like Mark was saying, that it's very easy to just say, we did this, we're good, we don't need to look at it anymore. And I know that Mark and Endgame are not doing that kind of thing, but when companies start adopting this, you have to be careful that it doesn't become that discrete event that's just yes, done, and you don't think about it anymore. And that's what Mark was saying as well about that kind of thing.
Well, that sort of begs part B of the question is, and we've talked about this in other contexts before on the show, of what kind of qualifications or maturity level do people need to have to be able to benefit from the framework? For instance, to know not to stop with it and not to think, okay, I've checked all these things and we're done. Sort of part B to that question: does the framework, and I promise I am going to study it once I get off the road in the next couple weeks, does it lend itself to teaching the SOCs and the blue teams, methodologies, types of things to look for over and above the specific things that it apparently identifies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it identifies a set of things to look for. I think it's useful. I mean, it's most actionable by people with a little bit of sophistication, because if you're running your own program and your own data collection, you have to have a certain amount of sophistication to get the right data, organize it, and make it queryable. And then you can go start asking questions like, hey, can I see malicious use of Reg Server 32? And hey, what's my coverage of malicious uses of PowerShell? And can I see new services being created? That's all the types of question that these atomic units of attack give you. We try pretty hard at Endgame to try to make it accessible to even folks with less experience, and so we're doing things to try to help answer the "Hey, am I good?" question by simple stuff like if you get an alert in our platform, we'll tell you what technique ID it's associated with and link you to MITRE for some more background information on that technique. So if you don't know why you should care about Red Server 32 doing things on your network, you click and you can get to some references and try to help educate people with a little bit less experience through the tooling and kind of make that labeling and information gathering easy.
Yeah, Mark, what are some of the other ways Endgame's using the framework? I'm curious to kind of hear the reception and reaction from the endpoint subsection of the security industry, and also how you're using that for customer benefit.
Yeah. I mean, the educational benefit I just mentioned is huge. A lot of customers do ask us, buyers aren't always. There's a huge variation of level of sophistication. You get some buyers who are kind of more familiar with just traditional AV, and they're not quite sure how to test maybe a more advanced product with a lot of additional functionality and EDR capabilities kind of layered in. So we use Attack to help. And one thing we did actually is take our internal testing framework for some of our analytics called Red Team Automation, and we open sourced the thing to help help testers and even just any user in a company. You don't need to be an Endgame customer to use this thing, but it's a Python framework to generate activity on your systems that corresponds to attack cells, and then you can measure. Kind of measure your detection capabilities there. So start to give your blue teams kind of something to chew on. And there's a couple other great frameworks. Red Canary's got one that we really like a lot called Red Team Automation. Uber released something called Meta that's really good to try to emulate, kind of map different activities of attack, make it easy for somebody to click a button and use it. So, and we've done kind of a lot of things like that. Again, a lot of it on the accessibility front, and then internal to my team. Again, we think about attack every day, and we think about our coverage. Do we have the right data to answer these questions, and do we provide the right alerting around these sorts of techniques that are very low false positive things that will just land in somebody's alerts queue right alongside a malware alert.
It's interesting, and not to get kind of philosophical on you, Mark, but when it comes about a framework like this, right? And what I've observed with this particular framework is that so many different organizations, so you mentioned Uber, security vendors, and even just someone who had the motivation to go create an open source project, all started creating open source software to support this framework. And I think that's kind of interesting. How do you believe that kind of impacts our industry and either aids defenders or maybe helps attackers? Because it could be a double-edged sword, perhaps. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, maybe attackers could make an assumption okay, these are. Let's assume that if it's an attack and it's a technique or a sub-technique, when those start to come out, maybe defenders are well equipped against those. So maybe attack matrix is always evolving. We see a MITRE updating this thing on a pretty regular cadence. Maybe they would use a technique that's not covered there. I never thought of that before. That could be part of a double-edged sword. But again, I think the universe of the number of ways to do things on boxes once you get access is limited. So this taxonomy is still a massive force for good. to guide defenders to have better defensive programs and do a better job setting up like layered defenses against intrusion.
How does this speak to visibility, Mark, in the organization? And I think we throw that term around so often, specifically in the security industry side of the house, right? And I asked some people, there were certain vendors, like, what's the problem you solve? And they'll come back and say visibility. I'm like, okay, that's nice. That's nice. Like I think I understand where you're going, but I'll put some context around that. What do you mean visibility into what, and visibility by whom into what? Yeah. So in this context, kind of define visibility for us.
Yeah, that's great. For me as a vendor, the question we get a lot, people look at attack, and again, they want to answer the "Am I good?" question. So a lot of their ideas, because it's what they're used to, is give me my pane of glass with all my alerts, and like, hey, do you alert across 100% of attack? And the answer is absolutely not, because I can't be generating alerts off my endpoint every time somebody creates a scheduled task, or every time somebody runs task list on an endpoint to get some enumeration. Like there's some things in attack that you can create a high confidence detection for and alert on. And, we do that for a pretty large chunk of attack. And there's other things that would be an insane thing to do in production. It would false positive like crazy, and they would kick Endgame to the curb and just throw us out because they can't deal with that. So we don't do that. But instead, it does get to the visibility question, which for us as an endpoint product, we're constantly gathering full visibility on all process execution events, DNS activity, what's the network, what is that box doing in the network, file writes, registry writes, modifications, image loads, all kinds of stuff that we're getting in real time on our endpoint. And visibility is all about making the data available for the user of the platform to ask the right questions of their data to find evidence of these attack cells having been sort of tickled by the adversary. So again, folks aren't as familiar with attack. There are lots of things in here, and the discovery tactic is a really good one. It's like, is somebody querying registry? The attackers sometimes use reg.exe to go query the registry. So do we have command line eventing that you can see what's happening in the registry? Net use commands being run as they're trying to enumerate, that sort of thing. And there's things like that where we provide the visibility and a really easy way to ask questions of the data in order to get to the answer. Does that make sense? I think that detections versus visibility is a really important distinction.
Absolutely. Carlos, you're noticeably quiet over there.
He's still sore about Jeff getting power back in 48 hours.
I think my only problem that I have had with MITRE and some of the tools that have been released as open source is that I've actually seen customers just simply go like, we don't need a pen test. We ran this tool. We're okay. We're detecting everything that is there. And actually heard about a couple of reports where some of the tabletop exercises were just running this tool and giving a blank stamp of approval to a blue team that they're covering everything. So, but that's bound to happen. People won't have the proper knowledge or context to use it, and there's always going to be uneducated people using it wrongly.
It reminds me a little bit of teaching to the test, in our school systems, where so much of the education system and funding and whatnot is based on, standardized test scores. So the teachers end up only teaching what they know is going to be on the test and missing out on a whole lot of other, wonderful educational opportunities.
Yep. Yeah, we've seen that a couple of times too. It's folks. I mean, we've tried to use this as like examples of ways to think about post-compromise detection. I totally agree that it does not simulate a pen test in any way, shape, or form, and it's totally lacking a level of creativity. I mean, some of the frameworks have started to chain an attack together, but it's still just it's just a run a script and it'll do 5 things. And yeah, I think it's a huge risk of attack is misuse of attack in that way.
Yeah, and so Mark, you mentioned earlier that MITRE's updating the framework, and as we know, there's new attack vectors all the time. Can you give us some insights into Endgame's process, given your position in the company, as to how you're updating your product for new attack vectors, how you're discovering them, and what the update process kind of looks like?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we kind of have our endpoint has a pretty robust set of data to provide that visibility already, and we've built a very easily updatable framework for our detections that can support additions of new techniques. So we're watching, we're watching attack. We're watching, I mean, like everybody else, as folks like Casey Smith and other great researchers like that are posting techniques. Sometimes they're usually kind of ahead of attack. MITRE will bring that stuff in a little later. It's certainly not the only way that we're bringing in new detections, and frankly, it's probably not even a primary way that we're bringing in new techniques that we may not have otherwise been aware of, just because there's a delay in getting it into MITRE. It's more good for us to have like a kind of it's a good reference for us as we create a detection, again, to provide an educational resource for customers and provide context for our users as they're using our platform. And of course, we do get the questions from customers like, hey, what is your coverage? And we try to provide a good nuanced answer back to questions like that. So it's not really, to the point of like teaching to the test. We don't really use it in that way. It's more of like a measurement and educational tool for us, and a way for us to talk to customers to like contextualize what it is that we're doing in a decent part of our product, which is the post-compromise portion of our product.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the testing process, I'm sure, is hard. Like, how do you know how you're detecting a particular technique in a given circumstance? And we talked about the open source tools for detecting these, and in your experience, Mark, like, what's the difference between something that tries to emulate an attack versus infecting something with actual malware? Is there some validity, to some of the claims where there might be stark contrast between those two?
Yeah. I mean, the whole concept of testing and measuring I think it's an unsolved problem. I don't think any of us would say that I don't want to get into the whole, morass of like the testing, but I guess a lot of the pay for testing remains basically malware testing and exploit testing, prevention testing that's more akin to a regular AV product. And, we tend to do great on that type of testing with malware and exploit prevention and all kinds of stuff that's set up. The measurement and testing for post-compromise stuff is a lot less mature. MITRE has embarked upon an evaluation of different vendor technologies that Endgame has been a part of, and results for that testing. I think they've announced that it's coming out in a few weeks' time, where they'll put out some kind of information about how different products provided visibility and detection across attacks. So we'll see kind of how that shakes out. Probably won't be the end state for what we need to be doing to try to provide like an unbiased third-party evaluation of these sorts of technologies.
Yeah, I find that very interesting, Mark. I won't invalidate the entire process, right? But I think what's important for our audience to understand is that anytime you're measuring the detection and measuring based on like how much it detects and those types of measurements, and I mean, don't get me wrong, I come from the vulnerability management background, right? Very similar in the way that we were compared, like how many vulnerabilities do you find versus how many vulnerabilities do you find, right? And I used to think that was a bigger deal than it was. Mark, what are some of the other things that our audience can do to incorporate inside their evaluations? MITRE attack framework being one, how much stuff that you can detect, but what are the other things, Mark, that you want our audience to consider when they're doing these evaluations?
Yeah, I mean, I think a big one is just the audience. There's going to have to be a nuanced read of any kind of results, whether they're internally generated and externally. Just again, because we can't have a situation like, hey, there's a data compressed section of attack. If we can't say that a product that sends me an alert every time somebody runs zip from the command line, we can't say that product is better because it alerted. Yeah. Well, like in-game only lets me have visibility on the command lines or like file system activity of zip files. Like I would say ours is better, but you could actually have a crappy test framework done that gives more credit for like an alerting detection. So I think just trying people that are consuming attack, and we touched on it a couple of times in this conversation, there is quite a bit of nuance required to not trip over yourself as you're trying to use this particular framework and make decisions based on this framework.
Yeah, and I think also, Mark, usability features, operational efficiency, and integrations are like the three other really big points, right? That I don't know if you can speak to some of those in Endgame's case and relate to our audience about some of those, even other things that they should consider, right? Because those things are important.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of does speak as you're talking. Part of what our product does is, we'll provide lots of really high confidence alerts, but if it's not a prevention, like if you said, hey, I just want to be in detect mode for malware, for example, you can do that with Endgame. Our policy configurations are very flexible. You're going to want to know what something did after it executed, and try to get what matters here. What's security relevant? So, in terms of enrichments and things and integration with attack, we're trying to provide as much enrichment and integration as we can with attack to say, hey, this thing, maybe it executed 12 child processes with these command lines and wrote these files and reached out to the internet and then loaded this library and did something. We're trying to analyze that data for the user and try to identify as much security relevant stuff happening associated with that attack context mapped to attack to help the user kind of answer that, well, what the hell am I supposed to do about this now? Which is a problem that we don't think anyone's done a very good job yet of solving. And it's a thing that my research team is investing pretty heavily in, is that, well, okay, I got alerts. Endgame generates great alerts. And I think a reasonable, a very high signal to noise ratio in those alerts. We put a lot of time into that, but it's we're answering also the, what do I do about this question, which is just something that's really talk about a high barrier to entry for teams. And, that's a pretty big deal out there. So we're trying to use MITRE as part of our solution to that problem.
And I think that's a great validation point, Mark, that you may not have realized that you just disseminated to our audience. And that is, when you're a security vendor and you're hearing feedback from your customers going, yeah, like we're liking the product and we're running it, but we're getting so much information, or we're getting this specific information, and now we don't know how to process it all, right? That's a testament that your product's doing the job it should, and you're pushing your customers to start tackle the next problem, which is, how do I respond and operationalize all this stuff, right? I mean, that's is essentially what you're saying.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's really awesome.
And another thing is that when we look at the framework actually defines a series of attack in a very basic way. And many times what you can actually see out there is that people will run all of these tools that run the attack one way, and just any regular attacker with a bit of modification, on obfuscation, encoding, just modifying a bit some of the parameters. Instead of going HTTP, let's use FTP for this URI. And now you've bypassed some of the checks of some of the tools. So it's not to describe the framework itself. The framework's great, but people need to understand that it's actually providing us a baseline. And when it comes to metrics, the way I've learned about metrics across my life the hard way is that every environment is going to have different metrics from one to the other. Mm-hmm. Each environment will define their own metrics depending on their own business needs, on their own capabilities. But at the very least, what I like about MITRE is that it's actually providing that initial practical baseline that can actually be used.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And then you start, again, it's the nuance. You start to think about, you're like renaming a tool or doing something. Like, it's pretty important to be having your data visibility, not only be like, you got to have your data be hardened, and I think that's an input into visibility. Like, is this easily bypassable? Like, can I just change the name of W script and bring my own version and call it xyz.exe and then bypass everything that I'm doing in my blue team that's looking for just wscript.exe running. We have a lot of things in our product to help provide some visibility into those sorts of evasions, but not, again, an unsophisticated user of attack is going to run in exactly to what you just talked about, Carlos, which is not be resilient against those sorts of things.
Mark, are there other things you wanted to speak to our audience about, and also, any kind of future enhancements or things you might be working on or feedback you want to solicit?
I think we covered a lot of really valuable ground here. I guess a couple of things that we've got cooking at Endgame, and what we've had it in our product for a long time is just hunting and post-compromise detection. Again, it's super important, but the MITRE attack framework maybe isn't the end-all be-all. There's things like, well, how in the world do I find in-memory threats? Things that might have successfully injected code into my environment and are running in a way that's evading all my defenses. How do I find things that are executing in the context of some of those, injected threads. So, we've got a lot of capabilities like that when it comes to post-compromise detection that, we think users shouldn't get too focused on just attack, solving that whole problem. The other thing that we've done at Endgame is, there's not really a great language to describe the analytics that you need to detect these sorts of cells. So we created our own language. It's a programming language, but a very simple one that people who have done Boolean logic will have a pretty easy time with, called event query language. We've done an initial blog post on that. We're looking forward to being at the MITRE Attack Con next week. I think it's here in the DC area, and I think it's going to be streamed for your viewers. I would really encourage people to check that out. I think you can still register to go on the web stream for AttackCon. We'll be doing a lightning talk there about how you can use EQL to develop robust detections, and we'll probably put out some more material on our blog about EQL. There's a post there now if folks want to go read about it, which is really good stuff. And we're also at AttackCon. Devin Kerr is doing a talk on a little more information on how vendors are using attacks. So, we got a presence there. There's a lot of other good stuff there. So I would say if people are interested in not just Endgame, but attack in general, MITRE's putting on their first Attack Con next week. I would encourage folks to check that out.
Awesome. Any final questions for Mark?
I'm good.
I do.
Yes,
have
Jeff.
Questions. And not necessarily for Mark. I've been sitting here listening, and Paul, you brought up a certain compliance standard, and I'm reminded of the dozens of customers that I've had over the years that, especially in the commercial world, that basically were doing security because they had to, because they were being, they're being held to the fire because of some compliance standard. And there's one in particular that has a lot of teeth. And I'm sitting here trying to think about, from what I've heard, attack is fairly sophisticated, and for a sophisticated, sort of high level of maturity, security analyst, SOC analyst, blue team or whatever. So I'm sitting here thinking, okay, so what about all those companies that don't have that capability? How is MITRE, how is anybody trying to sort of market this into the segment of the community that doesn't have the maturity level yet? And what I've heard, I'm sort of answering my own question, but I would love to hear commentary from Mark and others, is for those companies that don't have the sophistication like they've been doing all alone anyway, they're sort of needing to turn to security vendors and maybe to some degree security consultants, pen testing firms and consultants, advisors, assessors, and things like that, who in turn hopefully are familiar or are becoming familiar with the attack framework. And so there's almost like a secondary market for the attack framework that I'm hearing, which is really the vendor community, and it's almost a responsibility of the vendor community if we all collectively agree that the attack framework at a high level is a good thing. And I from what I'm hearing, I would tend to agree with that assertion. But I'm also always trying to figure out, but how do we make more companies secure so that security is not just for the mature companies that have the budgets to have the SOCs and the blue teams. So I appreciate that Endgame and hopefully other companies are taking a look at the attack framework and trying to reap the benefits on behalf of customers. So I guess the question ultimately is how do we market companies like Endgame and other companies that are trying to market the attack framework, but also market it in a way to say, hey, if you can't afford to, you look at the thing and you don't have no idea what it is, there's these companies out there that have your back, have your best interests in mind, and they're doing a lot with the attack framework. You should go talk to them.
Yeah, so I would say it's a great educational tool is one point I would make. And I would say it's a tool that it's not just a vendor thing. And I would actually say that the groundswell has been more so on the practitioner side. I mean, we've heard just, for example, tons of discussion in some of the ISACs about using attack, collaboration around that. So there's a good, I think it's coming from both sides, and it is certainly the more sophisticated teams, as opposed to the folks that, it's one person with no budget, trying just to keep their head above water. It might be a little harder to get arms around this. We're pretty big on the educational aspects of this. We wrote a book on threat hunting, which some of that maps to the attack framework, and we didn't market Endgame in that thing at all. We talk about how to use free tools like Sysmon and other things to create detections around this. So if you can anybody can use a free tool. A lot of places you can have varying levels of success getting data and sending it back to your SIM, and you can run queries there. So we do think that there are definitely ways for even people with limited budgets to get started, and getting started somewhere is better than not doing anything. So, I think if people are wondering where to get started, I would encourage people to just dive in. There's a whole column on execution. So you could just measure, hey, how can I see if these various sorts of things are executing on my network? And do I have visibility into things like code signing and all that sort of stuff. So we've provided some stuff up there with our threat hunting handbook that I will give it a nod, not because it's for marketing purposes, but it's actually pretty good content. You can grab the threat hunting handbook from our website. And there's other folks who put out similar materials and free tools. Roberto Rodriguez, Cyber War Dog, has done a lot of good stuff trying to encourage sharing of analytics and things like that. So there's some ways to get started. And I would encourage people to not feel intimidated by this wall of 200 techniques that you'll never be able to touch. If you do, start with 10, start with 5, start with 1, and maybe you can make some progress.
Mark, is there a level of maturity that you could articulate that you should have before you even start looking at something like the MITRE ATT&CK framework?
Yeah, I would be interested in other folks' opinions, but I think other security controls like good password hygiene. You probably want to make sure you have decent malware protection that isn't easily bypassed. So there probably are some things related to just get a few things knocked out before you embark on determining if you can see whether there's been DLL search order hijacking on your network. I wouldn't start here if you got a blank slate of and a really a total mess of lack of security controls and problems. But I'm interested in what everyone else would think on that front.
No, I think that last point summed it up, right? Like if you don't have a security program and you're kind of a mess, you don't want to start with the MITRE ATT&CK framework.
It's just going to overwhelm you, and you're going to be looking at all these things and feel hopeless about it, because when you look at that, so you have to back up and go to things like I don't know, COBIT or something, or just basic controls, and say, do we have just simple basic stuff before you start diving into these? It's great to use it to learn, because you go, I don't know what this is, I'm going to go learn what it is. But if you don't even know what password hygiene is, you got bigger problems than worrying about these sophisticated attacks.
Yeah, you got to have some vulnerability management and patching thrown in there as a kind of one of the steps. I think you got to have good system administration and change control processes. Mark's point about passwords is absolutely spot on.
The top, Paul.
Go ahead, Josh.
The top 5 or 6 of the CIS controls, formerly known as the SANS top 20, is exactly what we're talking about.
I agree.
Right?
You've
got to have those. If you don't have those top 5 or 6, CIS has turned it into 6 these days. But if you don't have those knocked out, then you have no business. I think.
But people do make that mistake,
and they're also in PCI.
But they do make that mistake.
But
all the time.
Jeff brings up a great point too. Making sure that you've got compliance taken care of is a higher priority, in my opinion, that you got to get done before you start looking at how do I prevent against some of these, attack vectors that are being defined. You got to have something to work with to prevent these.
Well, I would caveat that, Paul, with not doing compliance, sort of the checkbox approach, but doing compliance, looking at the PCI standard as a framework. Because it covers essentially the same things that the CIS Top 20 or the NIST Cybersecurity Framework covers. I mean, basic security hygiene is basic security hygiene. But Mark's touching on what I think sort of a subtopic of this whole marketing issue. When you if you're not doing the very basics, and you're only doing what's required, and you have this compliance attitude about doing, whatever bare minimum of security. In fact, I would even say if your attitude is what's the bare minimum I need to do for security, you're probably screwed in the long run. So, part of the marketing I think that needs to happen for the attack framework is how do you sell it to people that do have that mindset that I don't get all this, I don't understand this. this. And it's one thing to say start somewhere, but there's a lot of people who are like, well, why? I'm okay because I got my 20 boxes checked. But I think all of us would agree, well, no, there's a need to do this, that transcends whatever compliance or regulatory standards you have to follow. You're in business, you're trying to protect your own company, your customers, your users. You should be doing this just because. How do we either market the attack framework, or how do we use the attack framework to market the need for better security and better basic security hygiene?
Yeah, usually it's post-breach that brings those people.
Oh yeah, that's what I was going to say. Was that typically you won't sell those people on it. If you go to a small enterprise and you start trying to talk to them about this stuff, and they're going, "This is just not cost effective for us. We've got one person, and that's just the way it's going to have to be." As soon as they get taken out, then they're calling back, going, "Okay, tell us what to do now."
Yeah.
And we've seen a lot of some even bigger companies have a mindset of like, well, I'm going to go do this all myself. I'm going to get all this data. I'm going to get this massive data lake. I'm going to use my SIM. And that's even overwhelmed bigger companies. And so for us, our approach again has been to kind of try to make this stuff easy and accessible and do some of the heavy lifting, most of it really for our customers, give them a lot of flexibility in using the data, but also for maybe the less sophisticated, asking the right questions of the data and getting at the data, really, really easy, and then getting that educational process in place. I think you all, hit on some really good points there. That for us, at least, our strategy in addressing that and helping our customers goes straight back to those imperatives we have in our product. Is make it easy, make it accessible, and educate the user.
Awesome, Mark. Thank you so much for appearing on Pulse Security Weekly.
All right, thanks so much for having me.
With that, we'll take a short break and come back with our next interview, so stay tuned. Endgame's converged endpoint security platform is transforming security programs, their people, processes, and technology with the most powerful endpoint protection and simplest user experience, ensuring analysts of any skill level can stop targeted attacks before information theft. Endgame unifies prevention, detection, and threat hunting to stop known and unknown attacker behaviors at scale with a single agent. For more information, visit endgame.com. The average time between being hacked and realizing you've been hacked is 1 year. Can you afford to let an intruder roam your network for that long? Can your company weather the fallout when this comes to light? Black Hills Information Security can find the bad guys in your network and train you to do it yourself. Email consulting@blackhillsinfosec.com to find out how a hunt teaming engagement can help you find a persistent threat in your network. Welcome back, everyone. Just a quick announcement. Please join us for our webcast with Signal Sciences titled, Which Way Should You Shift in the SDLC? This will be held on November 8th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time. It'll be hosted by myself, Larry Pesce, and Zane Lackey. If you can believe that, Doug, that is going to be one fun webcast. That's really, I mean, I should probably just lead in with that.
Yeah.
It's me, so. Zane, and Larry, because that's a cast of characters right there. SecurityWeekly.com/Signal Sciences. Register today. And we're here with John Walsh. He is the product marketing manager for the Conjure product line. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Sweet.
It's not Conjure.
Did I screw it up already or no?
On the previous ad reading you did, but
I did. Okay,
you got
I
it.
did.
You got it now.
I was silly. It's conjure, like a wizard would conjure.
Unless you're French, it's conjure.
Conjure.
I was doing the French pronunciation.
You should try that. That's a really
it makes it sound fancier, I think.
Or like it's like perfume or something.
Yeah.
It's like Kim Kardashian presents Conjure. The smell of failure.
I like it.
Yeah.
So you should hire Doug to do your
smell of penetration.
Is he available?
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
He is for a fee. Doug's available for pretty much anything.
I mean, it's just like
Not that
Outback.
stuff.
Be careful what you wish for.
Conjure.
So you made the trek down from CyberArk has an office in Boston?
In Newton, yes.
Newton, okay.
Yeah.
And so you made the trek down?
Yeah. It was
Sweet.
a little longer than I thought, but I made it here.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Glad to have you here.
Thank you.
In studio. And talking about Conjure. Now you're messing me up because you said the other pronunciation, and Doug's doing the weird French thing. And now our audience will never forget that Conjure is a product.
That's true. Yeah.
It is actually. We'll talk about it. Well, actually, John, why don't you describe what we're talking about here when we say Conjure? What does that mean in the context of, well, it was an acquisition by CyberArk being brought into the fold. Tell our audience what this is all about.
Well, Conjure is a secrets management and authentication authorization platform. And CyberArk has been in the business of privileged access security for over a decade, right? And we've been in the application security space since before even DevOps existed, right? But Conjure, what that does is it's highly scalable, and it fits into highly elastic environments more easily, and it works better with some DevOps environments.
Why would someone want Conjure? What's the problem it's solving?
Well, it's solving the same problem that people have had for decades, right? Where you steal someone's credentials. I worked at another company, and people really didn't see the value of, say, SSH key management, which is one type of secret or credential, right? And until like Edward Snowden came along, people were like, oh, geez, I guess someone on the inside can like gain access to this, and then escalate their privileges to gain access to that until they get stuff they're not supposed to have, and they have access to everything, right? So that's one way, is the insider. And then the other way is externally, where there's been some recent breaches, mostly by nation-state actors, where they used some kind of malware or something, and then they're able to get inside the environment and then steal credentials or secrets to move throughout the environment, gain more access to everything. So they're spreading out that attack from the initial blast radius and getting access to pretty much the entire enterprise at that point.
And I think another great use case too is I've published source code Maybe I put that source code on the internet, and it just so happens that there's some credentials or secrets in there that anyone can just go view, right?
Yeah, no, it happens. It can happen anywhere, right? I mean, they have tools out there. One of the best known ones is Truffle Hog to look for those credentials. And why do they do that? Because people are doing what you just said. It wouldn't exist if that was the case. Right. And to take it a little step further, I once worked on this honeypot project to capture basically malicious traffic, right? So you put up a system out there, AWS system out there, and then you wait to see people attack it and how they attack it and how they get in. And they're getting in via SSH. It's via passwords, via SSH keys, right? And some of the passwords they're using were the Chinese word for change me. That was like one of the most common passwords that came up.
Doug, what is that? You're fluent in Chinese,
I don't
right?
know what I don't know what it is. What is
I'll
it?
get back to you. I forget.
I'll look it up.
I knew that was coming.
I'll look it up.
I don't want to say it 'cause I'm afraid I mess it up. But
apparently, Doug's knowledge of Chinese is to very specific phrases, and I'm not going to have him go into that because God, I don't want to know.
There's things you got to ask for, man.
I know, and I don't want to know what those are when you go to China, Doug. I really don't.
He's going to give you the wrong word, and you're going to use it. And
yes, exactly.
But the point is, they wouldn't be doing that if people weren't doing these stupid things, right? So putting their credentials, their passwords, their secrets in their source code. I think we all know about Uber, right? We all know that they've done that not once but twice. Oof. And they're not the only ones. There was another Chinese-based drone company where they had a similar situation where someone was able to find secrets out there in a public repository, and they weren't supposed to.
Yeah, I'll say that was DJI.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, we actually interviewed Kevin Finisterre about some of those. Yeah,
awesome. Yeah,
Kevin's the man. Also, John Stratton was telling me that he was telling me in Enterprise Security Weekly when I had mentioned Conjure. He's like, yeah, we've seen that. He's like, actually, I got a funny story. He's like, we found this service, right? He's like, we were scanning the network and we found this service, and every time you connect to this high number port, it would just spit back like 64 characters of what looked like random data. And he's like, we thought it was really weird. And it's like, after we like dug into it, he's like, it turns out that was a password. And they put it in a high port because they're like, oh, no one would see it there. And so their applications could connect to this port, grab a password, and then that password was used to authenticate to other things. And I was like, oh. And for our listeners, if you visit conjure.org/Security Weekly, you can get all the good stuff that we're going to talk about. Yeah. And you have an open source. So like if you're confronted with this problem, if you're a security professional and you're writing code and you have projects, which many of us do, right? Or you're interfacing with development teams and you either don't know or maybe you have an idea of how they're managing and authenticating, managing their secrets and authenticating. Right. If you don't know, it could be really bad because it could go back to John's example where there's just a high port that's spitting out a password, which is obviously really bad. Again, you go to conjure.org/Security Weekly, and now you can get this. A lot of this open source. I mean, describe what you get, what's open source, and then what the differences are when you go to the commercial side.
It's all out there, open source, and a little bit about my background. I used to be a developer, so I kind of know how they think. And with DevOps, they are the people that are going and grabbing those tools, unbeknownst to security. Sometimes,
sure,
we can get into that later. But so it may make it easier for developers to go out there and grab it, or even for security to go out there and grab it and see how it works and go through the tutorials and figure out, do it themselves, so then go back to security, back to the developers and say, hey, look, I tried this, I know how it works, and they can sound like they know what they're talking about to have some credibility. And what do you get for open source? You get basically everything. They're now in the same version, v5. The only thing you don't get is something that you would probably have more for like enterprise, is high availability, the GUI interface, and that's basically it.
Gotcha. So functional wise, pretty much they're on. Pretty much sounds like they're on par.
Yeah,
that's really awesome. And essentially, what we're talking about is secrets management or a vault, right? Mm-hmm. And so, can you describe, like at a high level, how all that works?
Yeah, and that's just one part of it. It's secrets management and also authentication and authorization as well. And you're able to set your security policy. And I think a lot of times when people think of secrets, they don't put them in the context of what that represents. And that represents access. So by controlling those secrets, you're controlling access. If I have your secret, I can gain access to what you can gain access to with that, right? So that's how you control it through
like
secrets.
in an API example, right?
API,
like
yeah.
my Twitter client ID and
Right.
his client secret is my secret to gain access to things. It's not quite the same level of access as I would get with the person's username and password, but it affords me access to that service on with that user's credentials, essentially.
Right. Yeah. No, it depends. It depends. In that case, it might not be the same access. In some cases, it could be more privileged access, and it could be more dangerous that they gain that
right.
access.
In Twitter's case, it's less privileged access.
Yeah.
In some cases, you're right. It could be more.
Right.
Because you have applications talking to other services or applications. Is that the most common use case for a vault in this capacity? Is it really a developer tool that I have an application that has to authenticate to something else?
It would be any sort of secret you can think of, right? So passwords, SSH keys, certificates, anywhere you use a secret. So you're writing code, and you have an API. You want to gain access. You want to gain access to a service, and then you have to use a secret to gain that access so that it can verify that you are that person you say you are. So what we do is we replace all of those secrets. And we take them out of the source code.
Yeah, why can't I just keep them in my source code? I mean,
well, like you said before, you check that into where? You check that into GitHub, right? Then what happens? All right. So like maybe your GitHub is public. Some people have like a private GitHub, but sometimes that's exposed accidentally. We've seen that time and time again. And then in addition, sometimes there's other people in the company who they have access to that repo. And they can look at it, and maybe they shouldn't be able to view that secret.
Or they reuse the code. I mean, you see people pull
Right.
code and they
Paste,
say, "Oh yeah, this is all over here. I just grabbed this out." That's a primeval DevOps problem too, because used to people wrote a lot of SQL queries and things into their code,
right?
And they had to put a password to log into SQL to the database, and it was in plain text. It was right there in quotes, and you could search for it. And a lot of times people had like code plans even just on paper. They would have all their source code on paper in file folders just sitting in the company, and they're all organized and they've got the names on the spines, and you could just pull it down and look and go right there.
Right.
And they use the same password over and over and over and over and over and over again. So even this compile code. So it's just a primeval DevOps problem to strip those things out.
Yeah, I mean that's the DevOps equivalent of writing your password on a little sticky and then putting it on your computer screen.
Absolutely. That's exactly what it is.
Except it's digital at that point. So
and distributed.
Exactly.
Leaving the password, the little Post-it notes all over the place on the subway platform.
Right.
Yeah, and what we do is we provide one central place for you to secure all those. Now there's many DevOps tools that have some of these capabilities built in, but these tools are not built for that purpose. We've dealt with some of these vendors. Puppet, Chef, and some of them come back to us and say, hey, look, security's not our thing. We have this one little feature here. If we get a customer, we'll refer them back to you, right? Because they know that's not really their cup of tea. And then you have to do that for several different tools. So like those different secrets providers don't talk to each other. And then you don't gain a full access to full visibility into your access picture as well.
Yeah, because there's so many different use cases. Like Doug was talking about, my application has to authenticate to the database. My biggest use case in the software that we're maintaining and writing is I've got to authenticate to multiple external APIs. And how do I store and manage those keys, right? You talked about SSH keys, right? And this is just for my application. When we talk about DevOps, now we've got CI tools and integration tools and development tools that also need to authenticate. Like, oh, by the way, I need to go push an entirely new environment up to the cloud. Well, how does your Jenkins tool or whatever automate that process without having the credentials? Well, it can't. I have to either put those in the clear text config file, right? Or I have to use some kind of secrets manager.
And there's credentials being put into almost everything now just to authenticate anything you pull. If you pull it down an API from the cloud, you want to access it, you may actually have credentials between there. So again, there's another set of password logins in there that are embedded in that source code. And boom, there it is.
Mm-hmm.
And then all it takes is somebody to distribute that code, and then if you just stupidly use that password all over the place, you've got to release an update. And
yeah, I mean, it used to be you had your different machines. They sit there, they're physical, but now you have infrastructure as code. So now, like, those secrets, they do sit into code. Like, you know, how do I get access to this, get access to that? So, like, actually, problems gotten worse.
Way worse.
And then one thing I saw a lot of was as people started building these like multi-piece systems. So they got a server here and they got a server there because they want to serve something. They want to serve DNS in the U.S. and serve DNS in Asia, as an example. They put the same passwords on both those systems because that way the person who manages them can easily log into all the all the different servers that are doing the same task. And all of a sudden, boom, there's the password, and now you just distributed the whole thing.
And so that's something we do manage, and then we can do that from like the DevOps space, but even from the on-prem space as well, like where CyberArk basically got its start, working with like large enterprise companies, you know, who are still using these servers today. I mean, they didn't throw all of that stuff out because it would have cost them a lot of money, and it still works. So you have to bridge the gap from that world to the world of DevOps. In a lot of cases, what happens is that they're grabbing these individual tools from different DevOps tools, or they're using something else. And so you have you know, one system for this, one system for that. And so with our enterprise password vault integration, we can now synchronize those two worlds together from the DevOps to the on-prem world. Right, so you don't have to worry about like having the password here, having it there, and then like having to manage all that. You can have that taken care of centrally from one place.
And it's even the management piece that we haven't even talked about yet, is that if there's a password that's hard-coded in my code, while I may do everything I can to minimize that risk, it might only be internally, I may not be putting in any public GitHub repos. Now what happens when I have to change or rotate that password, right? How do I do that if, like Doug said, it was in my code, but I checked in my code and Doug used my code, and then that code was replicated to another development group, and now it's in 25 different projects. When we change that password, now you just broke
everything.
Potentially 25 different projects times 3 because they got a dev, a QA, and a production. And by the way, the password is the same in all of them, and all of a sudden everything. I mean, that's an extreme example, of course, right? But it underscores the point.
Not too much, you know.
It's
not that extreme.
How you rotate and manage those passwords. What happens when someone leaves? Doug leaves and goes to another organization. He still probably has a copy of that code, and we all know that that happens. Now he also has my password.
I have it,
I always take code.
But that problem was, I mean, even a long time ago, that problem was there with your main databases because if you change one password, everything stopped working, and you might have hundreds.
Your manager comes to. You know, you change that password. Don't ever do that again.
No, I mean, they literally they had a note at a place I worked that said, "Do not change this password on the database," because all this different code in the company that was scattered across all over the place, all used that database, and they used that same password everywhere. And you were going to have to start making phone calls if you needed to change the password, because I was looking at it going, we really ought to change this.
Yeah, but now someone has to change code if it's in the code, right? And then if they fat finger it, recompile it, push it out, what other changes did I make it in a branch that I hadn't fully? I mean, there's a million.
It's an 18-month process.
You know, what we're describing is not. I mean, it is reality for many organizations.
In a lot of cases, in larger organizations, say like banks, people might not want to change that because if that system goes down, they lose their jobs. I mean, I know people. You know, because I worked in the space for a while where that's happened to people they know. They did something and everything breaks. So if you just leave it the way it's been for like a long time, what's the punishment there for them? You know, for the person doing it.
Right. Things still work.
Right. Yeah.
Everything's good.
So that's why you should automate it, and then just having something that's like hard coded like that. A secret is just bad coding in general. I mean, you learn that in I think high school or college when you're coding. You know, you don't put like a constant right there in your code. You know.
Yeah, they tried to teach me that.
It didn't sink in.
I guess that's why I'm not a software developer today.
I'm not either, so.
Right? It's just you write code for your own benefit, and you can break a lot of those rules. But you know, putting credit. So when how much do I have to change my code, John, when I want to use a secrets or a vault, right?
Right.
How do I have to change my code?
Well, if you're using nothing or something else.
Yeah, if I'm using nothing.
If you're using nothing, you'll have to change that to like an environment variable where we can populate that with the proper secret at runtime and inject
Yeah,
that
I mean, it may not be in my code, but it's in a clear text config file that I'm reading and including an environment variable. Oh, wait, that's kind of like the same thing, right?
Yeah, right, yeah, exactly. Yeah, multiple ways to skin the cat there.
Yeah.
So then in that case, I think it'd be easier to introduce a secrets management.
I'm just populating that environment variable with a different process through just pretty much a pretty simple function call inclusion of a library?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
It's that easy.
That's awesome. Joff, Carlos, Jeff, questions on this topic?
You got me.
You're just hard coding stuff right in your code or in the configuration file.
Actually,
It's like the heck with John. I'm doing it anyways.
I was doing stuff. I have to admit, I was coding. Oh.
I'm just curious.
Actively coding a password right into your code, Jeff.
That's right. I was actively coding, had credentials in my code. No, I was just kidding. I wasn't doing that.
I was curious because John mentioned something about
before
DevOps existed. When did DevOps start?
That's a good question. And I think that that depends on who you ask. And then
I'm asking you.
Yeah. Well, if you ask me, I would say probably like around 5 years ago.
Okay.
Yeah, it's if you read the Phoenix Project and listen to Beyond the Phoenix Project, Gene Kim, John Willis, and others, started bringing it into IT and security at some point. Was it 10 years ago maybe when they started? I'm not sure when exactly they started. They talk about it, Jeff, in Beyond the Phoenix Project, which is kind of like almost like a podcast, but they put it together as a book. Listen to it in an audio format. They talk about the first time that I think it was John Willis that presented at a developer conference and brought basically what they did, Jeff, was bring concepts from manufacturing, auto manufacturing in particular, into software and IT. And in the Beyond the Phoenix Project, they talk about how basically they just mirrored exactly what I can't remember his first name. Goldrat was the one that wrote The Goal and wrote Beyond the Goal, or there was an audiobook Beyond the Goal, and how Gene and others just basically mirrored that process. And the concepts in manufacturing that were in The Goal were started in when? The 70s? I want to say 70s.
Yeah, you could
is when
say
that started.
Right.
Or like, in the 70s.
See, like agile process, like Toyota.
Yes,
when they
Toyota.
started doing that.
That was like 70s, right?
It could have been, right? But when I worked at IBM as a developer, we probably started like picking up like around 10 years ago. So like maybe Toyota started doing it in the 70s, but then like when did other people actually start doing it? If like one guy that does DevOps, when does it actually become DevOps, or when does it take off? And I don't think it's until you have like a decent number of people actually doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I forgot what I was going to say because Jeff asked a very fascinating question. Oh, I'm sorry. Carlos was talking before. I wanted to make sure Carlos asked his question. Sorry, Carlos.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I've been there in situations where we've had a developer all of a sudden for one of the external test systems push out a key in an SDK in a code commit, and then having to figure how to remove that commit from the history in GitHub. To try to get it fixed. I've seen that happen, been involved in that stuff. And yeah, credentials are hard. Keeping a credential vault is also hard. I remember I've been in situations where I had multiple credential vaults to play in my lab to work on. And I remember there are some that by default are HTTP and not HTTPS. Others by default are not in the domain. Others send credentials to the loopback in clear text.
Exactly.
On the host. So yeah, it's a very difficult problem to solve.
And that's a really a couple good points there. You just basically mentioned what my point was about having like multiple providers or multiple different tools to do the same thing. So it makes it difficult because one tool does it this way, another tool does it that way, and that really increases the chance that you'll make a mistake. And if you're a developer, most likely you're not a security expert. You're just trying to figure this stuff out, get that done, and move on to the next thing. So that's why it's better to have one tool to do that and really have it managed by someone who that's kind of their domain, security.
Absolutely. Is that also a good segue into, was it Summon? Is your other kind of, almost, I want to say it's like an add-on to this process?
Mm-hmm.
What does Summon do?
It's just like a component that we use where you can replace those secrets with an environment variable for Conjure, and it works with open source Conjure or Conjure Enterprise, and then you can inject those secrets in real time.
It's actually pronounced Simone.
I know, right?
That's if you're using the fancy,
fancy French pronunciation.
The French version of Conjure.
Yeah.
Oh, and you mentioned, John, that when you register or download the open source, that there's a tutorial that you take people through. So there's an educational piece, and what's in that educational piece?
Yeah. I mean, because you were talking about how security maybe is like somewhat unaware, or like trying to figure out how to approach developers with this.
Even developers could be unaware as well. Sure.
Yeah, developers or security on our website conjure.org.
/Security Weekly.
You can go to the tutorial where it says try Conjure, and it takes you through step by step. And even if you don't know what you're doing, it's simple enough and educational as you go. So it takes you through the process of creating a secret, very simple, and then creating what we call machine identity, which verifies that container or that machine or application is what it says it is and not someone else. And that's how you authenticate that. And then you can set up a security policy where you can authorize it to certain resources. And this way you can both control authentication and authorization. And then we show you the difference in the tutorial. So you find out this particular machine is authenticated, but it's not authorized to this resource, while it's authorized to a different resource. And that's all controlled through your security policy.
Is that like a descendant of Kerberos kind of stuff? Because we used to use Kerberos to do something. It didn't have all those other pieces to it, but it was just so that we could authenticate that machine was who it said it was. It had a Kerberos ticket on it.
Right.
And then that ticket was validated when it tried to write a request to the database. That was one of the earliest things I did in DevOps, trying to get around this very problem, because it was just, how do I, even though I couldn't keep the credentials out, they're out there. I don't know what I'm going to do about it. But when somebody did a request, if they didn't have a Kerberos ticket on the machine and it couldn't be authenticated locally, the machine would refuse the request. So it wasn't as sophisticated as what you're doing, but that's kind of an old-fashioned.
There are some parallels to Kerberos. And I don't pretend to be a Kerberos expert, but there are some interesting parallels between them. Yeah.
At a high level, at my previous company, we've talked to customers who've tried to get rid of secrets that way, and it doesn't really work.
At the time, it was the only option I had.
So you use Kerberos to get rid of the secrets?
Replace everything with Kerberos,
I mean, I tried all kinds of things where it was restricting access, but it was all dial-in serial stuff, so it was really hard to restrict access, and people could dial in, and I was trying to get them to restrict blacklist phone numbers and all this, and that was hard to do too. Yeah. And it just got weirder and weirder, but then we found this Kerberos thing that MIT developed, and it was like, oh, well, this thing could actually limit, because it has to validate this ticket. It wasn't sophisticated like that, but it was the same kind of concept at a very basic level. It didn't get rid of the secrets. The secret was still out there, but it prevented someone who had the secret from being able to actually come in. So not only do you know the password at the door, but the person looks at you and goes, "Yeah, I don't know you," and they close the window in your face.
Well, we have the security policy that you can set up with a YAML file, so it's a lot easier to understand that access picture and authorization picture. And then that reminds me of, we talked earlier about you said you had kind of like an incident or a breach.
I was just going to talk about that. Yeah. So, and actually that stemmed from when we were deploying locally and internally, we are just learning Docker. We're just learning containers. We're just learning the tool set that, represents DevOps. And, no one's like born knowing this stuff, right? Like there's a learning curve for everyone. Like at some point, someone's got to learn the new technology and test it. And when we were doing that, we had like a catastrophic failure of internal hardware. And so, and this is a business critical software there. And I'm like, so we're pushing to the cloud now, right? And so we all raced to go up into the cloud. And over the weekend, we realized pretty quickly that we had forgotten to close down the Docker API. So it turns out that Jenkins was talking to the Docker API without any authentication. And when we push up to the cloud, we didn't apply policies to restrict that API. So our Docker API is hanging out there free and loose to the internet. And like within 48 hours, man, it was like almost instant that attacker finds that and goes, oh, sweet, I can upload my container through the API, and then I can use your AWS instance to DDoS, this other target. Now, fortunately, they were very noisy. And Amazon's, we had CloudWatch configured, and so like alerts were going up all over the place. Shut it down, do the cleanup, snapshots of containers, do forensics. It was like the lamest. I think I went through it on the show. Lamest, or in my presentation, or both, lamest malware ever. Like, it was just ridiculous. Like, I could do the forensics without doing even too much research, and I'm not by no means a forensics expert, and hadn't done that in a while on actual malware. So it was ridiculous. And so that's what happened. But when John, you and I were talking about that, I was like, had we thought about implementing, something like Conjure and having it provide that authentication, I think. It kind of spoke to an underlying issue that when developers are forced to push code out and rush out the environment, that they'll just leave the authentication out completely and go, I'll deal with that later. And then you start thinking about those points in your DevOps process where you've got a Docker registry and you've got a Docker API and tools need to tie those together. All of those things, you can configure authentication, but it's an extra step to do in your process. And if it's all local, you may go, that's fine. If it's all up in the cloud and it's not exposed and controlling, that's fine, but it's not. I think you really need that vault to control all of and help control all of that access.
And authentication.
And that has to be part of your DevOps.
Yes.
Because the problem is that all too often it's not a part of the DevOps. That's just a problem to solve.
That's security's problem.
And then they're like, our deadline is tomorrow, fix it. And you're going, everything works except I can't connect to the database or whatever. And it's just like, use anonymous. Or you just like, turn it wide open and we'll fix it. We'll fix it later. And it's not a part of the audit in the prod dev process for DevOps, and then it just slides on through, and the next thing you know, 8,000 people have it on their systems running, and it's you just hope nobody notices. It's compiled code nobody will ever figure it out.
And we address that through like what I mentioned before, machine identity, and what we do is we install a certificate using the very APIs that are built into that container orchestration platform, and then we use multiple factors that only the container that's legitimate would actually have, not just one factor, which could be the secret. It's multiple factors, and it's using just what's already built into that container orchestration platform. Nothing extra is needed, and it varies from platform to platform. But we built out those Kubernetes. I think one of the latest is the one for Kubernetes, and you can see that on our conjure.org blog, where we just explain it in detail. It's pretty interesting.
That's awesome.
I remember you were pretty excited when it happened, so it was a good learning experience.
Yeah, when we have a security incident, barring any, catastrophic repercussions, if it's basically of low impact and easy to clean up, as this one was, and easily detectable, I'm like, you know what? This is awesome. This is great. Like, it's a good learning. I mean, you learn more from your failures, right?
Exactly.
Than your successes. And it gives us, I'm like, because the developers are like, oh my God, like, there's a security. I'm like, this is awesome. And they're just looking like, what? What do you mean this is awesome? Like, this is going to be great. We get to do forensics. We get to do incident response. We get to talk about it on the show because we have to disclose these things on the show when they, when they happen. So it's a good lesson learned, from our mistakes in doing that too. But I think, it also underscores one of the other points that we made at the top of the interview, John, in that you may not know what your developers are doing to address this problem. How, like, if you're sitting there listening to this interview going, like, I wonder how my developers are solving this problem in the, 25 different projects or more that we have in our organization. Like, I wonder how they're doing it, right? Which is why I wanted to encourage, if you're a security professional and you have some software that can make use of this, to go test it out and then go have the conversation with your developers and say, okay, what are you using? Maybe they're using something different. Maybe they're using Conjure. Worst case, they're like, what are you talking about, Paul? I don't I don't know. We just leave our APIs open and hard code passwords in our code. Like, what's the problem, right? Everything works. To Doug's point, everything works. And the danger of that is once you set it up, especially in like a continuous integration, like, hey, Jenkins is working. Like, that's awesome. You forget that you're like, oh yeah, there was that one point. Yeah, you're so happy it works, right? Because your tool chain is like massive.
Willie said it's ready to go.
And you're like, well,
Call
yeah,
marketing.
I'll make a mental note and I'll go back and I'll add that certificate or add that authentication later. And you're just adding features and pushing that stuff out, and you forget until a security person, who hopefully is listening to this interview, comes to you and says, "Oh, by the way, Doug, like, what did you consider authentication when you set up those systems?" You're like, "Oh yeah, when I was installing it, yeah, there's nothing there right now. That's okay, right?" And you're like, "No. You need something like a Conjure to help manage those secrets."
And later is tough, because then you're
later
going back and you're saying, we're going to have to do a version update, to fix this across all the people that installed it.
Like Carlos was saying, it's hard to go figure out where those are. How
you've gone beyond the edge, and you're not coming back.
Yeah.
That's true. That's it.
I'll start using buzzwords where you'll shift security left. That's what you should do in the process. But I think it makes a lot of sense here. And that's where security needs to get involved, where they do need to talk to the developers, see what they're doing. Because if you ask what the developers are doing about this, being an ex-developer, they're doing the easiest thing possible, because this is not what they get paid to do.
And a lot of security people were not trained in app development either, and they're not very strong coders. And they go down there to the coding shop, and they come in, because I was acting as an auditor, and they didn't know what my background was. And literally, you'd listen to the programmers go, "I know you can't understand things like programming." I'm going,
Well, and this is an interesting case where you can be a pretty good programmer, maybe even expert programmer, in a security context. Like, I think of the way that I, write software and scripts, like, it's really like just for me, right? And I think a lot of us security professionals are in that same boat. Like, when I write something, it's really just for me. And if I release it open source, it's because it helps other security professionals, accomplish that one quick task. But when you look at how you're developing commercial software or large open source projects, that process is very different. And that's where I think the knowledge gap is. It's not so much that we don't understand programming as security professionals. I think a lot of us do. I think it's a pretty common skill among us. We certainly encourage that new people coming into the field have that skill. Different skill being able to write code versus be an actual software engineer that's participating in writing code that's being rolled up into a release and rolled out to customers.
And a Python script's not the same thing as a gigantic application that supports manufacturing at Ford Motor Company that's got 8,000 subparts and was written by 100 different people over 42 years.
Different ballgame entirely.
And so that it's very difficult for security auditors, security professionals, to look at that code. And guess what? When you go to the programming shop and you tell them we need to look at this, they're going to go, "It's all fine and everything's working. We're on version 15.2 sub 5. Everything is cool." Don't put a red dot on our board. Because they don't. I mean, I ran the programming shop, and I know what happened when somebody came in there and was put red dots on my board, going, that screen that's like purple? It could be kind of a more greenish color. Going, "I will kill you where you stand."
You've talked a lot, I think, on your previous shows about DevSecOps, and a lot of people view DevOps as already including security, and that's where I disagree. I think, especially in this regard. Because most people I've talked to have been to a lot of trade shows. When they talk about security, and I say, "Hey, DevOps security," like, "Oh yeah, you're scanning registries, and you're making sure that there's nothing like no vulnerabilities, and everything's up to date." Like, well, that's just one component of security. What are you doing about access? And so, like, that's why it's not already included in DevOps.
No,
and my point earlier wasn't that developers don't know anything about security. They might, but there's no way they have like the 10, 15 years of experience that a professional security person would have.
And don't forget, an awful lot of us programmers grew up in an era when security was, considered unnecessary, because only weird Spock types could even understand what you're doing. So why would we need to worry about it? I mean, I've been told that before.
A denial of service attack was knocking all your punch cards down on the floor.
Yeah, something like exactly what it was. Yeah, that's what you should describe it as, the denial of service attack. We called that a deshuffling.
Deshuffling. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Hey, nerd.
Oh boy. Okay, I think we covered it really well. I was glad we had that conversation.
Yeah,
I thought
that's a very nice thing to know about.
It is. It really is.
You should look into
useful.
this if you haven't looked into it already, because I'm really a fan.
John, thank you so much for appearing on Paul Security Weekly. You're going to stick around for the next segment?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, awesome. I encourage all of our listeners to go to conjure.org/Security Weekly. Check it out. It's open source. You can download it, mess around with it, integrate it into your projects, test it out, and have better conversations with your developers, more productive conversations with your developers.
Bend them to your will.
Yep.
That's right.
And
with that, we're going to take.
I'm on Slack, so you can reach out to me. On
Awesome.
Slack.
Is there a Slack channel for Conjure?
Yep, it's on conjure.org.
Awesome. We'll be right back. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies. Protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week, Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences' patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences. Demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW. Domain tools help security analysts turn threat data into threat intelligence. They take indicators from your network, including domains and IP addresses, and connect them with nearly every active domain on the internet. Those connections drive risk assessments, help profile attackers, guide online fraud investigations, and map cyber activity to attacker infrastructure. Fortune 1000 companies, global government agencies, and leading security solutions vendors use the Domain Tools platform as a critical ingredient in their threat investigations and proactive defenses. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/domain tools. Welcome back, everyone, at TruePaul Security Weekly. This is our security news segment for this evening. Quick announcement, one of our illustrious co-hosts, Patrick Laverty, will be co-presenting pen testing tips, tricks, and stories with Aaron Herndon at B-Sides Connecticut 2019. Ticket sales are open until the end of the show. Set until the day of the show, which is
Time is running out.
Bye now.
It's not until November 2019. But you must get your tickets today.
You got about 40 minutes before it. Anyway, so Saturday, November 3rd is the end. Until the day of the show. That's made me confused with our show. They're $20. You can go to bsidesct.org and register now. And now I have John Walsh's intro. He's a DevOps evangelist at Cyber. Oh, we established that already.
We've already done that.
Yeah, we did that.
It was again if you want.
If it's on the teleprompter, Burgundy reads it. John is still here with us, of course. So
it's Paul's age. You know, when you get a little older, you start to repeat yourself. And,
that's right.
You know,
things get all wilty.
Sam, you're gonna grab his walker for him, and so he can, get out of the studio tonight. I'm not sure he's going to make it.
I know, I need glasses. That's a sure sign you're getting old. So, security news. There was an article that was published to a site, Dark Reading, and it was about auditing. And the title kind of grabbed me, and I'm not sure if it was clickbaity or not, but I really think they're being serious. And now I get the point. So here's the thing. The title is Audits, the Missing Layer in Cybersecurity. And so when you hear that, you're like, whoa, hold on. There's a lot of things that we could point out as being missing in people's security programs, and like auditing is not really. It's not high up on my list. Anyone else? Is it like near high up on your list? Carlos had to drop.
No, boo, hiss.
Right?
No, yeah.
But here's the thing. I think when I thought about my first experience with auditing, right?
Your first experience?
It was an experience because I had never as a security person, I had never kind of interfaced with auditing. I'm like, well, this is interesting. Like our goals are pretty aligned, right? On the surface, and I realized that the audit was like they were just asking me questions about lots of things, what I did, how I did them, and then the state of things. And I was like, well, that's kind of interesting. Like, what prevents me from being the hacker mindset? I'm like, what stops me from lying? Right? And just,
not a damn thing.
Right? Like, not a damn thing. And so then I said to the auditor, I'm like, well, if you really want to know the state of the systems, like, we should do things like run a vulnerability scan.
Right.
That'd be awesome. Right? And then, of course, back then you find some pretty heinous problems, and I made people a lot upset because they're like, hold on. We had these audits. Things used to go really well.
Yeah.
Paul came along, and like the pigeon flew in, shit all over everyone, and then flew away. Like, what is up with that?
The first time I ever did an audit, I went in and I had no idea what to do. These people asked me, can you come do this? And they had been doing audits, And I went in and I actually sat down and started testing things. I didn't,
Yeah.
And then I got yelled at for
They
like
did
15
too,
minutes
yes.
because they were like, what the hell is this?
How dare you?
We have passed this with flying colors every year for 5 years, and now all of a sudden here you are, and we've got every single thing is marked wrong, fail. And I'm like, that's because they don't do any
I'm
of these
glad
things.
it was just not just
No,
me.
it was like I was sitting there like, oh no, I'm sorry. I thought that's what they wanted me to do, and they were
I
like,
was just
no.
being diligent.
You ask the IT person, do you use passwords? And they say yes. And then you
And
put
check.
a check mark.
Right.
You don't go look to see if there's actually passwords there. I'm like, you have anonymous logins. Like, we don't want to hear that crap. Yeah, it was bad. And
So I felt really bad about that pretty much until just
if
now.
I may,
Go ahead, Jeff.
PCI, Jeff, say
in
PCI.
deference to those listeners that might be auditors, and I certainly know some, and well, I don't know if I respect them, but I have friends that are auditors. I don't respect.
Now,
the
I
crap.
haven't talked about the benefits of auditing, so if you're in auditing, Jeff, and you're listening, right?
I'm a big advocate. You just got to do
Yeah.
it right.
Okay, so Jeff, go ahead.
Well, what I want to say is, I think one of the fundamental problems with an audit process is the people that write the audit requirements typically are pretty smart and they're pretty thorough. What is often lacking and mileage varies is the people that are reading the questions, that are asking the questions. They don't always have the background, the knowledge, the context of knowing what they're asking, what it means in a bigger picture. And I have to throw in a little pitch or a thumbs up for PCI, because the beauty of PCI, if done correctly, was always you ask the question, are you using passwords? And they could lie to you. But then the beauty of PCI to me was always, okay, now let's go look.
Yeah.
Show me how your systems are configured. Show me your vulnerability scans. Show me your pen test report. Show me your hardening standards. Show me your password rules, and so on and so forth. So there was always this element, because a lot of my customers were accustomed to this audit process. I can say whatever I want. But the rubber hit the road when we went and looked at the systems. I'm like, yeah, that doesn't look like what you said that you were doing.
Well, also, I think before we get to some of the things that I think Doug and I probably agree on that we like about auditing is that you should ask yes/no questions. Those have to be intermixed with like how and what questions, and then, as Jeff said, then go like actually look at things, right? And
percentage, yeah.
And so we use your what I think is kind of a lame question, like, do you use passwords? If the answer is yes, it's like, okay, well, how do you use passwords?
Okay, best one on that. Okay.
Well,
so I asked this girl.
one more thing, and then
Go
I'll
ahead.
let Doug and
That's okay.
you guys
Go ahead, Jeff.
pontificate.
It's okay.
I think it's important for us to define our terms, because PCI since the very beginning has been called an audit. I've got a customer right now that keeps referring to it as an audit. It's not, and it's an assessment. And the difference is, and it's sort of a legal thing from the PCI perspective, but an audit is when you are asking these questions, you're looking for something measuring to an exact standard. Like, do you use passwords? Are they 8 characters long? Do they have uppercase, lowercase characters? There's some sort of an exact thing that you're measuring against. Are you doing this? Yes, no. Whereas an assessment is more of, let's take a look at things and let's take a look at whether you're doing things correctly or whether you're doing things, according to industry or security best practices. So it's more of a judgment call. It requires the person that, and I was often and still am called an auditor, it requires that person to have a background knowledge, have some sort of clue as to what it's all about, and make a judgment call in many cases. But it's not necessarily yeah, you're doing the right thing according to this measuring stick. You're doing the right thing based on, what your business is, what your environment is, what all your different, factors that get, come into play, your connectivity, your third-party connections, and so on and so forth, which is what the nature of security is. It's, we talked about it on an earlier segment. It's very subjective at times. It's hard to have a precise, like the MITRE ATT&CK framework. It's hard to have one exact, one-size-fits-all, this is how you do security, because every environment is different. And there's all sorts of different factors that go into it. So I'll shut up and let you guys say what you like about the audit.
Financial audit does the same thing, though. Financial audit doesn't just ask you a question and say, "Do you trade, with this?" They drill down and they test and they look at how. They just don't know how to do it. When they reassigned auditors from accounting over to doing security audits, they had no idea what to ask people. But my funny story that Jeff cut off was that.
Wait, one more thing.
My story was
only mutes me. It only mutes me.
My story was that I asked this woman, I said, "Do you use strong passwords?" And she said, "No, it's Valley Days." And I said, "What?" And she said, "No, it's not strong. It's Valley Days." And I was like, "What is Valley Days?" And she said, the password for the systems. And I was like, "Oh, well, let me write that down." Okay,
let me write that down for later.
It was all passwords.
Yeah. Well, and I think that we've already identified that there's varying skill sets of auditors, which is why it's harder to ask if you don't have the knowledge and understanding the how and the what questions. Like, how are you enforcing your password policy, and how are you measuring the effectiveness of your security controls around your passwords,
and like Jeff said, and how does it work from this system to this system to this system?
Yeah.
Because you'll go into a company and they've got Apple, they've got Windows, they've got Active Directory, they've got MVS with RACF mainframe stuff, and all those are different kinds of systems that behave in different ways, and that's really challenging for people that have never seen any of that stuff.
But if let's say I'm the CISO of an organization, right? I think for me in that position, the value of an audit is not so much auditing the state of my systems, it's auditing my processes. I would, in certain circumstances, and where this makes sense, right, have an audit, I want to know where I'm deficient and where I'm strong in my processes. Where did you...
I agree.
And you can do this without... You don't have to necessarily go in and do a full-blown pen test or phone scan, right? You can have someone that's pretty smart that goes in and understands the security landscape and asks people questions and come back and say, you're deficient in these areas process-wise. Here's the process improvements you need to make. That's where I think huge amounts of value from
I agree and disagree, Paul, because while it's important to be able to have that background knowledge so you can go in and make a judgment call on how the processes are working, from an audit perspective, from a measurement perspective, how do you do that? And how do you...
It's tricky. Yep, I agree. Yeah.
I mean, one is subjective and one is objective. Maybe that's the way to describe it. Audits tend to be objective, where assessments are more towards the subjective. Yes. And there's a lot of really, really smart auditors out there that I've met, but I think if I could try to synthesize it down to something that, and this is not meant to mean that we're better than anybody else, those of us in the hacker community, but I really do see a difference between people that have had hands-on experience, whether they're hackers or whether they're admins or whether they're developers. You have a different view of the world than if you've just sort of have the book knowledge, the professional training, certs or whatever, but you've never really been in the trenches and done it. You can be smart about it and have a book knowledge, but there's still a difference between that and having actually done things.
And that's the two layers you're talking about, and Paul was talking about too. One of those layers is up here, this subjective layer of policy and procedure stuff. Do you use strong passwords? Here's what we're defining as that. And then this objective layer of how do we go in there and test this RACF system to see if you actually have strong passwords on all these accounts. How do we go in and test this Active Directory system, and on and on and on? And so there are two different layers, and they almost require two different personality types to look at. And it's a long, drawn-out process.
Well, it's knowledge, right? So like you keep mentioning RACF. I've seen like where people actually in sessions where they're auditors, they're trying to learn what RACF is and like how it works, right? Well, good luck with that. So like they're not usually technical people. It's not really personality, it's their skills, the skill set. Right, and then like some of these compliance frameworks, it's something like make sure that production data can't be accessed from development, so on and so forth. How does an auditor figure that out? He needs technical skills, or she needs technical skills to figure out, okay, it's via these accounts, via these SSH keys, passwords, whatever it is, they can access this, then they can access that through like a transitive trust.
And it's just like pen testing. You got to have a team.
Yeah.
Everybody's got different skills. So you've got those people that are sitting there. Like I had an auditor on my team who was an accountant, And that person was making sure that we were looking at this from the right perspective audit-wise. Like, were you asking the right questions and all these things? And then they had me to sit there and say, well, this is what you could look at in Active Directory, and, oh, have you considered that? And, oh, there's another account on that AS400 called SecOffer. Did they change the password on that too? Oh, they didn't? Well, there's a big problem.
Right. Yeah.
And people that had those kind of like hacker skill sets that held these like little minutia details were really, really useful for looking around that corner and looking at, we didn't just test this one real basic thing. There was all these other pieces of it that we really ought to look at, because it's not just a matter of did everybody use 8 characters in their password.
Yeah. And what I like about the audit is it sounds like you actually want to find out what the best result is. You want to find out the best way to make sure you're completely secure. And then when you think of compliance, usually you think of like what checks the box. Like, all right, I met that, done. Met this, done. Which essentially is like saying
I actually think the perception is the exact opposite of what you've just said.
For audits. Right. No, but I think for compliance in general, people they're trying to meet that compliance framework, and they're just trying to move on. They don't want to spend extra money or time or cycles on trying to be more compliant.
Yeah, they just want the certificate.
Right, exactly.
Do we still have to, changing gears, talk about IoT security and the lack thereof? Because I tell you what, like I see in at least a couple articles a week, and I'm like, yeah, that's like the same problem that we've been talking about.
It hasn't changed
for 10 plus years. It hasn't changed. There was a article that was describing vulnerabilities in controllers could allow attackers to manipulate marine diesel engines, and that sounds really sexy and interesting. And then when you read it, like someone did some kind of testing or assessment and found vulnerabilities, and it's like, well, the firmware contains an undocumented drop bear SSH server with a hard-coded username and password, which is easy to crack. Well, it's like, well, yeah, like, how many times are we going to see that problem before?
You said hard-coded username and password that's easy to crack? What the hell? It's just a hard-coded username and password. I mean, shit.
That's it. Well, that's actually really interesting.
Well, not to mention that
the way they
actually
frame that
cracks passwords to begin with. But, we've only been arguing that for 30 years.
Maybe it was easy to read off your terminal screen when you run a basic strings command against the firmware and go, oh, hey, look, it's SSH credentials.
There you go.
I think when they built a lot of these things, they weren't thinking of that as a computer. But nowadays, a lot of these things they're basically like a Raspberry Pi, which is like pretty much a Linux machine.
Right.
You know, so like they're thinking, oh, well, I don't have to worry about this, I don't have to worry about that. They got a little lazy when they were coding
that, and I think they were just sort of, I think they were lazy. I think a lot of people design stuff were engineers, and no offense to engineers, but they don't think about security a lot of times. How do you make something work efficiently and quickly and get the green dot instead of the red dot? And they also have the Spock problem, which is like, who would figure this out? Who's doing that?
They also had the Modbus problem too.
But that's really different from lazy.
Transmits process control information via unencrypted Modbus communications. It's like, well,
there's
I don't know. I don't want to say I get myself in trouble, but there's a lot of people with opinions that work in the industry that are like, I think my assessment from what I've observed is that forward-thinking organizations that are in industrial control systems have recognized that Modbus does not meet the requirements to satisfy integrity and security, but yet it still finds its usage. And I think that's not dissimilar to other areas. I mean, we just talked about passwords and password vaults.
Right.
Like maybe, like a lot of organizations haven't realized that hard coding passwords is a bad thing, but it's the forward-thinking ones that are like coming to John and going, hey, tell us about the vaulting thing. That's really cool. We want that, right? So
yeah. Same thing, different environment.
But there's also another element beyond lazy and beyond, well, it works. I mean, I think of so many customers I've had, think retailers that are nationwide and they're trying to push things out to hundreds, if not thousands of local area networks that are all over the country, and they got to push things out and they need to administer systems. It's real easy to understand why they would use, let's say, a shared account for administrative purposes, which we would all agree is probably a bad idea. But you can certainly understand why it seems like it's the practical, almost how else would you do it type of thing. So there's sort of there's the laziness, which I think we we pay disrespect to too many developers and admins when we say it's lazy, because I don't think it's always lazy. I think it's more often it's sort of the business requirements / we don't have the budget, we have to do it this way to get it done, versus the we didn't know any better, but it worked, so why not? Why not?
But there's also in that same environment, or a boat or whatever, there's an engineering creep problem too, where we built this motor, it's this giant thing, it's got thousands of parts, and okay, this year this engine company is going to replace that part with this new part that's controllable by this other part. And I didn't respec this entire device. I just designed it initially, and it was fine. But then they came back and they put this computer controllable carburetor thing on it, or whatever. I don't know anything about engines. But they stick some piece on there, and then that thing's managed by another piece. Well, okay, the original designer doesn't know about that. That was added later, 5 years later, because they don't want to replace the entire engine. It'll cost millions of dollars. So they're just replacing this little piece. Now it runs better, and you get better efficiency out of it. Oh, but that thing's got a compromise in it.
You've added functionality so that they stick with that motor and don't go to a different motor, and they or whatever. But maybe that's a bad
your
example
fancy
in that case,
business terms for that is, I don't care.
Yeah, or like Y2K, right, where they were using 2 digits, which was fine at the time, and then they weren't thinking ahead. I agree. Lazy is the wrong word. It's just not thinking ahead.
They used 2 digits not because they were lazy. They did it to be efficient, because they had very little to work with. Yeah, and saving 2 characters mattered in 1965,
right. And it matters for IoT as well.
Yeah,
right?
In a huge way. In a huge way.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway,
we're all in agreement.
Yeah.
Damn it.
Hey, can I interject a hacker adventure story?
Oh, yes. I was going to segue into that.
Story.
Yes, please do, because the stories this week, we have a few to talk about. They're not as bad as last week. Yeah.
I'm going to cut him off and tell a PCI story, though, now.
Everyone behave. Come on now.
All right,
okay, Jeff.
We're going to get in a room together.
All right.
So I was in Atlanta, ISSA International Conference. I spoke there yesterday. It was a lot of fun, yada, yada, yada. Good times were had by all. Whenever I go to a town, I always have to find, is there a cigar bar? Is there a cigar lounge? Where am I going to support my habit? Thanks, Paul. And when I searched for a cigar bar, I found that there was not only a cigar bar that was a block away from the conference hotel, it also was advertised as a speakeasy. So I'm like, oh, that's really cool. So
I thought you were going to say it's strip club, because that's Atlanta.
That would be the ultimate, right? But you can have a Clinton cigar.
Ooh.
Not going
so
there.
It's called the Red Phone Booth. You have to show up, and it's like an English style phone booth. You go into the phone booth, and you have to dial a number, and that'll unlock the door, or it'll ring the phone on the inside, and somebody will come open the door. And a sidebar, it was funny because I went there last night, and there was this guy that was obviously a hipster millennial standing in the phone booth, and it was a rotary phone with the old style, you pick it up and hold it to your ear thing. He had it in the cradle, and he was just kind of looking at the dial thing and just kind of spinning around. I'm like, that guy doesn't know how to use a phone. And then it occurred to me, he's probably never even heard a dial tone, because you have to go in, pick it up, and listen for the dial tone, dial the number, and then it rings and you get in. But that's not the story. So I was there. Joe Gray happened to be there speaking, so we were going to hang out. And I said, hey, I know the speakeasy. Let's go. And there was another guy with us. I won't say his name on the air because I don't have his permission, but a real cool guy, threat detection guy. We get inside, and I had my security weekly shirt.
Wait, hold on, Jeff. How did you figure out what the phone number was? Did you just find it on their website, or how difficult did they?
I'm not going to tell on the air because it'll be recorded. It's a social engineering exercise.
Is it written on the bottom of the phone?
Nope. We can talk about that later, but I'm not going to put it on the air.
That's fine.
That's part of the aura and the mystery.
So you figured out the puzzle. Yeah.
We got in, we're walking in, and the guy that turned out to be the owner, he sees me wearing, I have the Security Weekly shirt on that I worn for the talk. And he's like, Security Weekly, what's that? And I said, well, it's a podcast. We do computer network cybersecurity. And he's like, oh, I might want to talk to you. I need to talk to you guys. And of course, Joe picked up on it. And And we went to the humidor. We got a couple cigars. They had a nice Opus X that I got. I was going to splurge and have a nice Opus X. And we ordered a couple smoked old fashions. And so
this is a place I got to go to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, it's a great
sold.
place. I'm telling you, it's a great place.
Opus X and a smoked old fashioned.
So,
yes,
we're sitting there. I probably had, I bought these two guys cigars plus the Opus X. I probably had almost $100 in on the cigars, another probably $50 on the drinks. The guy finally comes over and he's sitting and talking to us and telling us about his problem, which I won't go into the details. And we're like, yeah, we can help you. We can help you out. So he takes us and he says, come, follow me. Takes us upstairs. Turns out they also have a restaurant. And he's like, I'm hungry. Takes us into their kitchen and he starts whipping stuff out and starts serving us all sorts of hors d'oeuvres and dishes. And he starts the stove up and starts cooking his stuff.
Did you get roofied?
Well, we were the guy that Joe and I didn't know. He was like, "This is really weird," and Joe and I like, "No, it's cool. It's cool. We're all right. We're all right." So he served us probably $100 worth of food, and we finally started looking at his laptop trying to solve his problem, and so on and so forth. And when we went upstairs, he's like, "You can't take your cigars up," and I'm looking at my half smoked Opus X. I'm like, He's like, "Don't worry, I'll give you a box of cigars." So. At the end of the night, we helped him out. We gave him some recommendations on how to improve, just his operations, what he's trying to do, and he's so grateful for us. I went to pay the tab; it was taken care of,
Wow.
and he gave me a box of cigars.
Nice.
From Red Phone Booth, and Paul, when I come up next time, I feel like I should share some of these with you since it was because I had the Security Weekly shirt on that started
awesome.
the whole thing rolling. So it's called Red Phone Booth. The owner partner that we worked with, a guy named Alpha, a really cool guy, and they're expanding. They're going to be opening up a new restaurant in Nashville soon, and of course
Nice.
Joe Gray lives in Knoxville, so he's sort of halfway in between. So if you're going to go anytime, anybody that's going to Atlanta anytime, check out Red Phone Booth. If you want to DM me, I could give you the number to get in, and look for Red Phone Booth to open up in Nashville. I think he said early next year.
And they're like wicked secure now.
Yeah.
And they are so much more secure. Oh, so they offer memberships, so you don't have to go through the whole phone booth thing, and they use biometrics. You give a thumbprint to get in if you're a member, and so his issue was with the whole member database and securing all the privacy data. And Joe was suggesting how he could do it he was actually suggesting a cloud solution so he could reach it from both locations. But really cool, good drinks. Really good humidor. They had a good selection, and definitely our kind of place to hang out in if we need to figure out a way to get to Atlanta together.
Yep. Adjusting in my head, adjusting our conference schedule so that we can work that in.
That's right. That's right. Well, actually, I think Sam has been talking to Joe. Hacker Halted will be there next year, and Joe said, "Hey, you should come to Hacker Halted," and he wants Security Weekly to come to Hacker Halted. So maybe it'll all come together and work out.
Sweet.
Hey, that sounds like a plan.
We're in. We're in.
Cool. All right, thank you. But back to the news.
Back to the news, which is nowhere near as interesting as
Jeff's story.
Smoked Jeff stories and smoked old fashions and Opus X cigars.
Yeah.
I feel like I did ourselves a disservice. We just smoked whatever was in the humidor and just poured whatever brown liquor we had into a glass. Like I feel like I'm
smoking like an Opus One and
like a third class
drinking,
citizen over here.
Old
I'm smoking my
tail or something.
Super Bertha, big
Technically,
gigantic.
that's an Opus I.
That's right. Yes, it's a 1S Super Bertha. The cigar was like this big when I started, and it was massive.
That's what you say all the time.
This thing just fell apart.
Yeah,
anyway,
that's what she said.
It's good.
Yeah, it was massive when I started.
It was. It's so small now.
Geoff, have you looked into the Secure Shell vulnerability at all? Let's talk about Secure Shell.
Yeah.
I did a little bit, and I've gone around patching some things today.
Oh, yes, indeed.
Right?
I mean, I was at a conference, so I haven't had a chance to dig into the details. From what I saw, it looked like pretty devastating if you're using the particular libshell library.
Yeah.
But it also looked like it was a pretty easy fix.
It's a patch. Yeah, they have a patch out for it. So it's just if you haven't patched up your SSH, and it is if you use libSSH, but if you open SSH, it's not the same thing. But a lot of Linux systems use libSSH and so forth. So be sure you're patched up.
Well, it was interesting, though, because I was talking to a buddy of mine, actually a guy that used to work with me 20 years ago, and he was the one that told me about it, and we were talking about the ramifications of it. And, and this is one of the things that PCI tells you to do, but nobody really follows, and that's to have an inventory of what you have in your environment in terms of systems and operating systems and applications. And it's really hard because, OpenShell didn't happen to be affected. But how many people, when the Heartbleed thing came out, a couple years ago, and Paul and I were still at Tenable, all sorts of people were, clamoring, trying to figure out where is OpenShell, who's using it, and it was embedded in so many things. Same thing with this libSecureShell library. Right. How many people know that they have it, yet alone?
I mean,
that all
links back to the API problem we talk about all the time, which is the APIs are so complex and you don't know what's embedded.
API, I'm so happy, Doug.
Well, it's like
you don't know. I mean, that is just. Oh,
I know. He got me. I finally gave in. I'm going to say that.
It's not AP.
Yeah, I'm not happy. Yeah.
Oh God, you had to just coax him into saying it, John.
I was just trying to clarify.
But yeah, I mean, you don't know what all's there. You don't know what products you have that have embedded those libraries in them when they were compiled. So you may not be able to see that thing, and it may be sitting in all kinds of places that you don't know about. So. And it's sad because it's SSH is like
and what's even worse is and this is maybe just me being too much of an idealist, but there's too many companies out there, too many organizations, and there's too many software vulnerability management vendors that sort of perpetuate this. The way you do discovery, run a vulnerability scanner. I'm idealistic enough to think you ought to know what you have before you use it. I understand that can be daunting, but something doesn't sit right with me where the solution is, are we vulnerable to this? Is just simply to go run the scan, whatever the scan engine is. To me, you ought to have some clue of what you've got.
But I still think that's challenging today. And much of my time today is spent finding solutions that actually work to recommend to our listeners and such. And I think that if you're developing your own software, there is a great set of tools and multiple vendors that are offering great support for finding vulnerabilities in your open source software and libraries that you might be incorporating. Right. As we were talking about before, John, right? Like you give developers a task and requirements, and you're like, okay, this is good. Like, I got some security processes in place. And they're like, yeah, I'm just going to go out and maybe not use, something like Conjure. Or I'm going to go out and find whatever open source library that I can just so I have to write less code, right? And it solves the problem for me. This is great. I'm just going to include it. There's a great set of tools to be able to identify that in your environment on an ongoing basis, right? And, I mean, there's some gotchas and challenges there. I mean, having everyone on the same version control system and knowing that that's the one that everyone is using, because, you got that development group that has their own version control system that doesn't have the protection software on it to identify the libraries that might be vulnerable. In any case, I think that's a good, giving good visibility into that particular problem. Yeah. And then we look at, I might have applications and software that are running on systems that I can scan, and I might be able to find things that way. But then what happens, and we're talking about, the library, what happens when it's in that IoT device, or it happens in that black box application that I have really no good way of testing.
Or I developed Cthulhu 1.0, which consists of 19 tools I bought from other developers that I have, I've embedded them. I embedded IoT devices in there, and all this stuff becomes this giant, multi-tentacled monster that I'm selling. It's really tough to go back and say, let's. I know that PCI says we're supposed to do that.
Right, and to Jeff's point, I, of course, like you said, I was at Tenable during Heartbleed, and I was like, well, yeah, the best way to find this is just to go scan everything. But there's especially with a common library, so many different iterations. And I think, Tenable and others did a really good job of allowing organizations to find as many instances as possible. But, there's still gaps. There's still stuff that's hanging out there that's still vulnerable to Heartbleed today because it's hard to find that library. Not only that, we talk about all these great tools and techniques and tactics. this is work that an
Right.
organization has to
Yeah.
do to go uncover those hard things, right? Like a lot of things with a lot less effort are easy to identify. Some major missing patches in Windows. Yeah, you probably find that pretty easily. Find a library somewhere that it's got a vulnerability that's embedded in some
Right.
application deep inside your network in an IoT device. You got to really be looking, and even at that, you might not find it.
You're raising a really good point, Paul, and I don't have an answer for it. I don't know if the industry has an answer for it, but in as much as we rely on the vulnerability scan engine, whichever one it is, or
Sure.
we get to use all of them to find these things. And I have to mention PCI again, because PCI has this peculiar problem of the system that typically introduces card data information into your ecosystem is not the point of sale system, because that's the cash register. It's the card reading device. It's the thing
Yep.
that we go up to the cash register and swipe, dip, tap our cards. And that thing historically has been what we would call in computer speak an ancillary device, an add-on. It's an attachment. And it's not, I don't know any scan engine, Nessus included, that it has a really good way, reliable way of reaching out to plug-in devices, ancillary devices on systems to find out what their vulnerabilities are. And I'm sure there's other examples out there. I'm just PCI is near and dear to me. But my point is, we rely on this particular type of technology to discover vulnerabilities, but we're limited in their abilities to do that. And there's things that are out there that are hard to find, not by the fault of the scan engines, but just by the nature of how things are architected and how things are put together.
And lots of scans are discrete. We do them and we stop. And then I go out and I have to replace this box that went bad, and I go pull an old one out of storage and put it back in, and all of a sudden the vulnerability is right there.
Yeah, and when I've spoken to some enterprise organizations that are, large enterprises that are doing a really good job in their minds of discovering everything new on their network, right? The best ones know, and they're like, yeah, we know we're not finding everything. And they often come to, us and say, well, how do I find that 1%? And like, what do you tell them? Like, yeah, you might find that 1% today. Tomorrow you got a brand new 1%, and that could be a completely different investigation to go for that new 1%. And I don't know that I have a really good solution to that problem, to be honest.
There may never be a really good.
And Jeff's example is perfect, right? I know that the next 100 stores that are, or let's say the next 50 stores that are rolling out, they're using new card readers that are different from the last 100. So even if I solve that in my existing 100 stores, this new one's rolling something out, and maybe you get ahead of the problem. We talked about shifting left, right? You get ahead of the problem, and you're like, okay, we're going to do an evaluation of that, that add-on, and halfway through the rollout, they realize their manufacturer's gone out of business, or they can get a cheaper one from this other manufacturer, and that's what's going to be rolling out. Hasn't gone through testing. How do I verify that doesn't have some kind of backdoor in it or some kind of vulnerability?
It's like whack-a-mole.
Well, how do you do it in an automated sense?
Yeah.
Maybe we have to figure out how to do inventories of systems and devices and applications and components, and figure out a way to somehow find out what they're running. Have some sort of require the vendors, whoever's selling it to us, to give us some sort of idea of what's going on the inside. And if it's not their stuff, it's their third-party provider, and so on and so forth.
And identifying these devices is so hard too. Like, I'm looking at two-factor authentication keys, right? And we know that Yubico makes one of those sets of keys, right? And they've got a new set of them coming out, and they're always updating their product line. Largely, I think, I don't know if they're necessarily manufactured in the U.S., but let's just say they're not manufactured in China, and I'm pretty sure that Yubico keys are not manufactured in China, right?
Taiwan.
I wouldn't be completely sure.
Yeah.
It's speculation on my point. But what has been pointed out is that Google's new Titan key is really just a Feitian key, and Feitian's a Chinese company that also makes Feitian branded keys that you can buy for cheap on Amazon, because I bought 2 of them. And now I'm kind of faced with this decision. I'm kind of putting this out there, feedback from my listeners. I know Feitian's had a vulnerability that was in fact fixed, but who do I trust with my two-factor authentication key? How do I know, like, what's the risk there? And I think that's what comes to the problem we're talking about. What's the risk that 1% poses? Unless you're finding it, you kind of don't know what the risk is, right?
Right.
But once you do identify it, and maybe it's that card reader, Jeff, right, was in this example, like, oh, well, this comes from Google, and someone along the way goes, hey, we can save $150,000, and, you know, Facian makes a reader that's the same thing, and we'll just switch to that. And it presents itself on the system when you identify that USB device as the same damn thing. Right. The ID is the same, the manufacturer is the same, and you're like, oh, like, we're good. Like, that's a reader that I know about, but really it's not. And then when I was looking at the multi-factor authentication keys, I was like, these are saying like they're the same thing, but what's the difference? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's
and you're not the typical consumer that's even going to ask that question,
right?
Yeah.
Most people are like, "Oh, it's the same, but it's cheaper. I want the cheaper one."
Right. And that, you know, is a segue into a different conversation about, you know, consumers and end users. What are you going to make them go through for authentication? I think, you know, hardware-based tokens, as many of us have experienced, are not the right solution for end users. I think there is a security benefit, but is it enough to force your users to have that much inconvenience? Because the thing that sucks is when you get on an airplane and you're not checking a bag, and you put your bag in the overhead, which, by the way, has your multi-factor YubiKey authentication keys in it, and
your hip-hop outfit.
And your hip-hop outfit, and your cigars, and when you get off the plane, that bag is no longer where you put it, and you're like, where did my bag go? And I'm like, shh. And that's another reason why I've disassociated those YubiKey keys with all my accounts and looking to go to something different, because for a period of almost 24 hours, someone else was in possession of my second factor key, which no longer works because... Again, it was out of my possession for a significant amount of time and out of my control.
Yeah. It's sort of scary that this was actually out there for like 5 years, right? So it's a 0 day, but it's like 5 years old, which sounds very odd on its surface. And like you go back to Heartbleed, like that was out there for how long before someone found it?
Oh wait, you're back to libSSH?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No, you made a big jump that I had to process. Yeah, no, that was good. Yeah.
Yeah.
What was the name of the bash shell vulnerability? It was around for 20 years,
right?
Until somebody discovered it.
And so, like, probably people knew about it, but they don't want to expose it because they're using it, right?
Well,
so for how long were people actually using this?
Probably as long as it's been out there. Somebody knew about it.
Right.
It's just not everybody wants to go in there and trash you so that they get caught. So a lot of people want to keep things to themselves and keep them subtle.
Exactly. So
they can exploit lots and lots of devices for their own ends and not get revealed. So it may have been used ever since it was available.
And why does that happen? Like, say with SSL, when Heartbleed came out, I wrote a blog that talked about how actually like the equivalent of like 2 people actually work on OpenSSL, right? And that was like news to a lot of people. So like
that was a wake up for the open source. Sorry to cut you off, John, but
it was
my subsequent reading about that issue. That was a huge wake up call, and they have since then been working to change that environment and put more funding to get more developers on these, especially these critical applications.
Right? Like I noticed that there was a big difference like after that, because that's like the plumbing layer, and you have like billion-dollar companies who rely on that. And they put nothing back, right? And the way I explained it is like you see open sources like take a penny, leave a penny, and the ashtray or the little dish at the gas station.
I do use that as an ashtray sometimes. Yeah, that's fine.
Right? Yeah,
to ash my cigar right in the change going through.
But you either have like the billion-dollar companies just taking all the pennies, or you have Paul putting his ashes in there.
That's right. That's my contribution back.
John's touching on something that's sort of a fundamental thing, because from the very beginning, 25, 30 years ago, the hacker community put all their faith and trust in open source because you could receive the source code, lots of eyes on it. That was the presumption. That open within the hacker community. Now within the corporate community, those that listen to the vendors and buy from vendors, it was always, well, we need to have commercial off the shelf. We need to have commercial stuff. I had countless companies that had policies that said we don't use open source, we only use commercial products and applications and so forth. And we as the hacker community that believed that we're always right and we're smart and we know everything, had this basic sort of paradigm or theorem that says open source is better, and yet it turned out, not so much, not necessarily.
That's a very good point. Like my experience as a developer, and I wrote this at the blog at the time too, that just exactly what you said. Just because it's out there and everyone can view it, they think it's safe. There's nothing in there, right? So this update for Heartbleed was written by someone who was like one of the top developers for OpenSSL, right? And so like when I was a developer, if some guy who wrote this was like the best developer at the company, and I have like a million things going on, am I gonna take my time to go review that? Like, no, that's so and so. He's good. I'm sure it's fine. I'm not gonna look at it, right?
As an end user of open source, I'm like, holy shit, it compiled. Like, sweet. I don't have to go look at the source code or modify the source code. Like, I'm good, right? And that's most of its role, right?
Yeah, exactly. You know, and the people's time's very valuable. Not go back and look at that, and it has the opposite effect because everyone can look at it. Not everyone does. Now, you send me an email with just me on it. It says, look at this and review it. I'm going to look at it. You send it to like everyone in the company. It's written by the best guy in the company.
Yeah.
Why would I review it?
And it's also that sociology thing of when it's out there, like, oh, well, someone else is looking for security bugs in it, right? There was whatever that. There's a name for it. There's the famous case in New York. Student study where they're studying sociology of where someone was getting murdered and
the 152nd Street cannibal study,
car crash or something.
It was a murder where everybody witnessed it.
Yes,
I forget.
Everybody else figures somebody called, and I know
people that are listening to this after its release are yelling the name out in their cars.
You're idiots.
It's idiots. It was this, but anyway, that's the same. It's the same concept.
No,
but if you stop and listen to what John's saying, I mean, he's basically saying that we're in the hacker development community just as guilty as all those people that we like to say are stupid and lazy. We're doing the same thing, or we've done the same thing.
Right.
There's an implicit assumption in open source too that not only are people looking at the source, they're actually using their brain and intelligently analyzing the source for free. Right.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
That's horseshit. It's not happening.
Right. I agree.
No, it's not free, right? So I deal with mostly the open source side of things at CyberArk for Conjure and our other tools, and some people view it as like, hey, everything's free, And I've talked to a lot of vendors, right? So either people, they'll give back to the community, they'll write features, or if you charge them for it, they basically expect you to do all the work for them.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm a master at Google. It was Kitty Genovese in March of 1964.
Where everybody listened to her getting killed, and I remember that. And she was like screaming, and everybody just said, somebody else will call.
Yep. Thank you, Jeff.
And that can't happen these days because everybody has smart devices. They would videotape it.
Well, that's true. Everybody would have it on.
Put it on YouTube.
It'd be on YouTube like before the police call got carried out.
Yeah. It reminds me, I want to give our labs team a plug. So, they do a lot of research. We have a bunch of, ex-Israeli intelligence people working at the company just trying to find issues.
Ex-intelligent? Does that mean
military intelligence?
They're not intelligent. Oh, intelligence.
They had to leave that when they left.
I didn't want you to get in trouble, John. You said ex-intelligent people. I didn't want them to be offended.
You can't take that with you when you go.
But they did a lot of research recently with Jenkins, right? And one of our researchers was credited with finding 3 to 6 different vulnerabilities in Jenkins, right?
Okay.
So how long were those out there? And that's just him going and trying to break it, find different ways you can break it.
Probably not that much time either. Actually, your labs people are awesome. We did a segment with your labs people a couple of years ago. They found that they could force a machine or flip into safe mode. And basically, if you get a Windows machine into safe mode, none of the protections work.
It's crazy. They wrote a series of blogs, and I had to help them with the blogs. And I say blogs loosely because they were each 15 pages long. They wrote a script, or they wrote their own tool to do this or that, and it's very detailed. And you guys should definitely check it out on the cyberark.com page.
Yeah.
It's pretty
awesome.
Cool.
Sure.
Awesome.
Well, I think that rounds out the show. Thank you, everyone, for participating. John, thank you for visiting. Reminder to our listeners, contra.org/security weekly. Go mess around with the open source tool. I think that's really cool and a good thing to do. It should end up on your list of things to try out. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next time. Doug, take us out.
Over on 10-7.